Section 21 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 21. But Miriam Finch's family, of which she seemed so independent, had not been without its influence on her. This family was of Middle West origin, and did not understand or sympathize very much with the artistic temperament. Since her 16th year, when Marian had first begun to exhibit a definite striving toward the artistic, her parents had guarded her jealously against what they considered the corrupting atmosphere of the art world. Her mother had accompanied her from Ohio to New York, and had lived with her while she studied art in the art school, chaperoning her everywhere. When it became advisable, as she thought, for Miriam to go abroad, she went with her. Miriam's artistic career was to be properly supervised. When she lived in the Latin Quarter in Paris, her mother was with her. When she loitered in the atmosphere of the galleries and palaces in Rome, it was with her mother at her side. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, in London and in Berlin, her mother, an iron-willed little woman of 45 at that time, was with her. She was convinced that she knew exactly what was good for her daughter, and had more or less made the girl accept her theories. Later, Miriam's personal judgment began to diverge slightly from that of her mother, and then the trouble began. It was vague at first, hardly a definite, tangible thing in the daughter's mind, but later it grew to be a definite feeling that her life was being cramped. She had been warned off from association with this person and that, had been shown the pitfalls that surrounded the free, untrammeled life of the art studio. Marriage with the average artist was not to be considered. Modeling from the nude, particularly the nude of a man, was to her mother at first most distressing. She insisted on being present, and for a long time her daughter thought that was all right. Finally the presence, the viewpoint, the intellectual insistence of her mother became too irksome, and an open break followed. It was one of those family tragedies which almost kill conservative parents. Mrs. Finch's heart was practically broken. The trouble with this break was that it came a little too late for Marian's happiness. In the stress of this insistent chaperonage she had lost her youth, the period during which she felt she should have had her natural freedom. She had lost the interest of several men whom, in her 19th, 20th, and 21st years, had approached her longingly, but who could not stand the criticism of her mother. At 28, when the break came, the most delightful love period was over, and she felt grieved and resentful. At that time she had insisted on a complete and radical change for herself. She had managed to get, through one art dealer and another, orders for some of her spirited clay figurines. There was a dancing girl, a visualization of one of the moods of Carmencita, a celebrated dancer of the period, which had caught the public fancy. At least, the particular art dealer who was handling her work for her had managed to sell some 18 replicas of it at $175 each. Miss Finch's share of this was $100 each. There was another little thing, a 6-inch bronze called Sleep, which had sold some 20 replicas at $150 each and was still selling. The Wind, a figure crouching and huddling as if from cold, was also selling. It looked as though she might be able to make from $3,000 to $4,000 a year steadily. She demanded of her mother at this time the right to a private studio, to go and come when she pleased, to go about alone whenever she wished, to have men and women come to her private apartment and be entertained by her in her own manner. She objected to supervision in any form, cast aside criticism, and declared roundly that she would lead her own life. She realized sadly while she was doing it, however, that the best was gone, that she had not had the wit or stamina to do as she pleased at the time she most wanted to do so. Now she would be almost automatically conservative. She could not help it. Eugene, when he first met her, felt something of this. He felt the subtlety of her temperament, her philosophic conclusions, what might be called her emotional disappointment. She was eager for life, which seemed to him odd, for she appeared to have so much. By degree he got it out of her, for they came to be quite friendly, and then he understood clearly just how things were. By the end of 3 months, and before Christina Channing appeared, Eugene had come to the sanest, cleanest understanding with Miss Finch that he had yet reached with any woman. He had dropped into the habit of calling there once or sometimes twice a week. He had learned to understand her point of view, which was detachedly aesthetic, and rather removed from the world of the sensuous. Her ideal of a lover had been fixed to a certain extent by statues and poems of Greek youth, Hyla, Adonis, Perseus, and by those men of the Middle Ages painted by Millais, Burne-Jones, Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, and Ford Madox Brown. She had hoped for a youth with a classical outline of face, distinction of form, graciousness of demeanor, and an appreciative intellect. He must be manly but artistic. It was a rather high ideal, not readily capable of attainment by a woman already turned 30, but nevertheless worth dreaming about. Although she had surrounded herself with talented youth as much as possible, both young men and young women, she had not come across the one. There had been a number of times when, for a very little while, she had imagined she had found him, but had been compelled to see her fancies fail. All the youths she knew had been inclined to fall in love with girls younger than themselves, some to the most interesting maidens she had introduced them to. It is hard to witness an ideal turning from yourself, its spiritual counterpart, and fixing itself upon some mere fleshy vision of beauty which a few years will cause to fade. Such had been her fate, however, and she was at times inclined to despair. When Eugene appeared, she had almost concluded that love was not for her, and she did not flatter herself that he would fall in love with her. Nevertheless, she could not help but be interested in him, and look at times with a longing eye at his interesting face and figure. It was so obvious that if he loved at all, it would be dramatically, in all probability beautifully. As time went on, she took pains to be agreeable to him. He had, as it were, the freedom of her room. She knew of exhibitions, personalities, movements, in religion, art, science, government, literature. She was inclined to take an interest in socialism, and believed in righting the wrongs of the people. Eugene thought he did, but he was so keenly interested in life as a spectacle that he hadn't as much time to sympathize as he thought he ought to have. She took him to see exhibitions and to meet people, being rather proud of a boy with so much talent, and she was pleased to find that he was so generally acceptable. People, particularly writers, poets, musicians, beginners in every field, were inclined to remember him. He was an easy talker, witty, quick to make himself at home, and perfectly natural. He tried to be accurate in his judgments of things and fair, but he was young and subject to strong prejudices. He appreciated her friendship and did not seek to make their relationship more intimate. He knew that only a sincere proposal of marriage could have won her, and he did not care enough for her for that. He felt himself bound to Angela, and curiously, he felt Miriam's age as a bar between them. He admired her tremendously, and was learning in part through her what his ideal ought to be, but he was not drawn sufficiently to want to make love to her. But in Christina Channing, whom he met shortly afterwards, he found a woman of a more sensuous and lovable type, though hardly less artistic. Christina Channing was a singer by profession, living also in New York with her mother, but not, as Miss Finch had been, dominated by her so thoroughly, although she was still at the age when her mother could and did have considerable influence with her. She was 27 years of age, and so far had not yet attained the eminence which subsequently was hers, though she was full of that buoyant self-confidence which makes for eventual triumph. So far, she had studied ardently under various teachers, had had several love affairs, none serious enough to win her away from her chosen profession, and had gone through the various experiences of those who begin ignorantly to do something in art and eventually reach experience and understanding of how the world is organized and what they will have to do to succeed. Although Miss Channing's artistic sense did not rise to that definite artistic expression in her material surroundings which characterized Miss Finch's studio atmosphere, it went much farther in its expression of her joy in life. Her voice, a rich contralto, deep, full, colorful, had a note of pathos and poignancy which gave a touch of emotion to her gayest songs. She could play well enough to accompany herself with delicacy and emphasis. She was at present one of the soloists with the New York Symphony Orchestra, with the privilege of accepting occasional outside engagements. The following fall she was preparing to make a final dash to Germany to see if she could not get an engagement with a notable court opera company and so pave the way for a New York success. She was already quite well known in the musical circles as a promising operatic candidate, and her eventual arrival would not be so much a question of talent as of luck. While these two women fascinated Eugene for the time being, his feeling for Angela continued unchanged. For though she suffered in an intellectual or artistic comparison, he felt that she was richer emotionally. There was a poignancy in her love letters, an intensity about her personal feelings when in his presence, which moved him in spite of himself. An ache went with her, which brought a memory of the tales of Sappho and Marguerite Gautier. It occurred to him now that if he flung her aside, it might go seriously with her. He did not actually think of doing anything of the sort, but he was realizing that there was a difference between her and intellectual women like Miriam Finch. Besides that, there was a whole constellation of society women swimming into his ken, women whom he only knew as yet through the newspapers and the smart weeklies like Town Topics and Vogue, who were presenting still a third order of perfection. Vaguely, he was beginning to see that the world was immense and subtle, and that there were many things to learn about women that he had never dreamed of. Christina Channing was a rival of Angela's in one sense, that of bodily beauty. She had a tall, perfectly rounded form, a lovely oval face, a nut brown complexion with the rosy glow of health showing in her cheeks and lips, and a mass of blue-black hair. Her great brown eyes were lustrous and sympathetic. Eugene met her through the good offices of Schottmeyer, who had been given by some common friend in Boston a letter of introduction to her. He had spoken of Eugene as being a very brilliant young artist and his friend, and he remarked that he would like to bring him up some evening to hear her sing. Miss Channing acquiesced, for she had seen some of his drawings and was struck by the poetic note in them. Schottmeyer, vain of his notable acquaintances, who in fact tolerated him for his amusing gossip, described Miss Channing's voice to Eugene and asked him if he did not want to call on her some evening. "Delighted," said Eugene. The appointment was made, and together they went to Miss Channing's suite in a superior 19th Street boarding house. Miss Channing received them arrayed in a smooth, close-fitting dress of black velvet touched with red. Eugene was reminded of the first costume in which he had seen Ruby. He was dazzled. As for her, she told him afterward, she was conscious of a peculiar illogical perturbation. "When I put on my ribbon that night," she told him, "I was going to put on a dark blue silk one I had just bought, and then I thought, no, he'll like me better in a red one. Isn't that curious? I just felt as though you were going to like me, as though we might know each other better. That young man, what's his name, described you so accurately. It was months afterwards when she confessed that." When Eugene entered, it was with the grand air he had acquired since his life had begun to broaden in the East. He took his relationship with talent, particularly female talent, seriously. He stood up very straight, walked with a noticeable stride, drove an examining glance into the very soul of the person he was looking at. He was quick to get an impression, especially of talent. He could feel ability in another. When he looked at Miss Channing, He felt it like a strong wave, the vibrating wave of an intense consciousness. She greeted him, extending a soft white hand. They spoke of how they had heard of each other. Eugene somehow made her feel his enthusiasm for her art. "Music is the finer thing," he said, when she spoke of his own gift. Christina's dark brown eyes swept him from head to foot. He was like his picture, she thought, and as good to look at. He was introduced to her mother. They sat down talking, and presently Miss Channing sang "Che farò senza Euridice." Eugene felt as if she were singing to him. Her cheeks were flushed and her lips red. Her mother remarked after she had finished, "You're in splendid voice this evening, Christina." "I feel particularly fit," she replied. "A wonderful voice. It's like a big red poppy or a great yellow orchid," cried Eugene. Christina thrilled. The description caught her fancy. It seemed true. She felt something of that in the sounds to which she gave utterance. "Please sing 'Who is Sylvia?'" he begged a little later. She complied gladly. "That was written for you," he said softly as she ceased, for he had come close to the piano. "You image Sylvia for me." Her cheeks colored warmly. "Thanks," she nodded, and her eyes spoke too. She welcomed his daring, and she was glad to let him know it. End of section 21. Section 22 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 22. The chief trouble with his present situation, and with the entrance of these two women into his life, and it had begun to be a serious one to him, was that he was not making money. He had been able to earn about $1,200 the first year. The second he made a little over $2,000, and this third year he was possibly doing a little better. But in view of what he saw around him, and what he now knew of life, it was nothing. New York presented a spectacle of material display such as he had never known existed. The carriages on Fifth Avenue, the dinners at the great hotels, the constant talk of society functions in the newspapers, made his brain dizzy. He was inclined to idle about the streets, to watch the handsomely dressed crowds, to consider the evidence of show and refinement everywhere, and he came to the conclusion that he was not living at all, but existing. Art, as he had first dreamed of it, art had seemed not only a road to distinction, but also to affluence. Now, as he studied those about him, he found that it was not so. Artists were never tremendously rich, he learned. He remembered reading in Balzac's story, Cousin Betty, of a certain artist of great distinction who had been allowed condescendingly by one of the rich families of Paris to marry a daughter, but it was considered a great come down for her. He had hardly been able to credit the idea at the time, so exalted was his notion of the artist. But now he was beginning to see that it represented the world's treatment of artists. There were in America a few who were very popular, meretriciously so he thought in certain cases, who were said to be earning from $10,000 to $15,000 a year. How high would that place them, he asked himself, in that world of real luxury which was made of the so-called 400, the people of immense wealth and social position? He had read in the papers that it took from $15,000 to $25,000 a year to clothe a debutante. It was nothing uncommon, he heard, for a man to spend from $15 to $20 on his dinner at the restaurant. The price he had heard that tailors demanded, that dressmakers commanded, the display of jewels and expensive garments at the opera, made the poor little income of an artist look like nothing at all. Miss Finch was constantly telling him of the show and swagger she met with in her circle of acquaintances, for her tact and adaptability had gained her the friendship of a number of society people. Miss Channing, when he came to know her better, made constant reference to things she came in contact with, great singers or violinists paid $1,000 a night, or the tremendous salaries commanded by the successful opera stars. He began, as he looked at his own meager little income, to feel shabby again and run down, much as he had during those first days in Chicago. Why, art, outside the fame, was nothing. It did not make for real living. It made for a kind of mental blooming, which everybody recognized, but you could be a poor, sick, hungry, shabby genius. You actually could. Look at Verlaine, who had recently died in Paris. Part of this feeling was due to the opening of a golden age of luxury in New York, and the effect the reiterated sight of it was having on Eugene. Huge fortunes had been amassed in the preceding 50 years, and now there were thousands of residents in the great new city who were worth anything from $1 to $50, and in some instances $100 million. The metropolitan area, particularly Manhattan Island above 59th Street, was growing like a weed. Great hotels were being erected in various parts of the so-called White Light District. There was beginning just then the first organized attempt of capital to supply a new need, the modern, sumptuous 8, 10, and 12-story apartment house, which was to house the world of the newly rich middle-class folk who were pouring into New York from every direction. Money was being made in the West, the South, and the North, and as soon as those who were making it had sufficient to permit them to live in luxury for the rest of their days, they were moving east, occupying these expensive apartments, crowding the great hotels, patronizing the sumptuous restaurants, giving the city its air of spendthrift luxury. All the things which catered to showy material living were beginning to flourish tremendously. Art and curio shops, rug shops, decorative companies dealing with the old and new in hangings, furniture, objects of art, dealers in paintings, jewelry stores, china and glassware houses, anything and everything which goes to make life comfortable and brilliant. Eugene, as he strolled about the city, saw this, felt the change, realized that the drift was toward greater population, greater luxury, greater beauty. His mind was full of the necessity of living now. He was young now. He was vigorous now. He was keen now. In a few years he might not be. 70 years was the allotted span, and 25 of his had already gone. How would it be if he never came into this luxury, was never allowed to enter society, was never permitted to live as wealth was now living? The thought hurt him. He felt an eager desire to tear wealth and fame from the bosom of the world. Life must give him his share. If it did not, he would curse it to his dying day. So he felt when he was approaching 26. The effect of Christina Channing's friendship for him was particularly to emphasize this. She was not so much older than he, was possessed of very much the same temperament, the same hopes and aspirations, and she discerned almost as clearly as he did the current of events. New York was to witness a golden age of luxury. It was already passing into it. Those who rose to distinction in any field, particularly music or the stage, were likely to share in a most notable spectacle of luxury. Christina hoped to. She was sure she would. After a few conversations with Eugene, she was inclined to feel that he would. He was so brilliant, so incisive. "You have such a way with you," she said the second time he came. "You are so commanding. You make me think you can do almost anything you want to." "Oh, no," he deprecated. "Not as bad as that. I have just as much trouble as anyone getting what I want." "Oh, but you will, though. You have ideas." It did not take these two long to reach an understanding. They confided to each other their individual histories, with reservations, of course, at first. Christina told him of her musical history, beginning in Hagerstown, Maryland, and he went back to his earliest days in Alexandria. They discussed the differences in parental control to which they had been subject. He learned of her father's business, which was that of oyster farming, and confessed on his part to being the son of a sewing machine agent. They talked of small town influences, early illusions, the different things they had tried to do. She had sung in the local Methodist church, had once thought she would like to be a milliner, had fallen in the hands of a teacher who tried to get her to marry him, and she had been on the verge of consenting. Something happened. She went away for the summer, or something of that sort, and changed her mind. After an evening at the theater with her, a late supper, one night, and a third call, to spend the quiet evening in her room, he took her by the hand. She was standing by the piano, and he was looking at her cheeks, her large inquiring eyes, her smooth, rounded neck and chin. "You like me," he said suddenly, apropos nothing save the mutual attraction that was always running strong between them. Without hesitation she nodded her head, though the bright blood mounted to her neck and cheeks. "You are so lovely to me," he went on, "that words are of no value. I can paint you, or you can sing me what you are, but mere words won't show it. I have been in love before, but never with anyone like you." "Are you in love?" she asked naively. "What is this?" he asked, and slipped his arms about her, drawing her close. She turned her head away, leaving her rosy cheek near his lips. He kissed that, then her mouth and her neck. He held her chin and looked into her eyes. "Be careful," she said. "Mamma may come in." "Hang mamma," he laughed. "She'll hang you if she sees you. Mamma would never suspect me of anything like this." "That shows how little mamma knows of her Christina," he answered. "She knows enough at that," she confessed gaily. "Oh, if we were only up in the mountains now," she added. "What mountains?" he inquired curiously. "The Blue Ridge. We have a bungalow up at Florizel. You must come up when we go there next summer." "Will mamma be there?" he asked. "And papa," she laughed. "And I suppose Cousin Annie." "No, brother George will be." "Nix for the bungalow," he replied, using a slang word that had become immensely popular. "Oh, but I know all the country round there. There are some lovely walks and drives." She said this archly, naively, suggestively, her bright face lit with an intelligence that seemed perfection. "Well, such being the case," he smiled, "and meanwhile—" "Oh, meanwhile, you just have to wait. You see how things are." She nodded her head towards an inside room where Mrs. Channing was lying down with a slight headache. "Mamma doesn't leave me very often." Eugene did not know exactly how to take Christina. He had never encountered this attitude before. Her directness in connection with so much talent, such real ability, rather took him by surprise. He did not expect it, did not think she would confess affection for him, did not know just what she meant by speaking in the way she did of the bungalow and Florizel. He was flattered, raised in his own self-esteem. If such a beautiful, talented creature as this could confess her love for him, what a personage he must be! And she was thinking of freer conditions. Just what? He did not want to press the matter too closely then, and she was not anxious to have him do so. She preferred to be enigmatic. But there was a light of affection and admiration in her eye which made him very proud and happy with things just as they were. As she said, there was little chance for love making under conditions then existing. Her mother was with her most of the time. Christina invited Eugene to come and hear her sing at the Philharmonic concerts. So once in the great ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria, and again in the imposing auditorium of Carnegie Hall, and a third time in the splendid auditorium of the Orion Society. He had had the pleasure of seeing her walk briskly to the footlights, the great orchestra waiting, the audience expectant, herself arch, assured, almost defiant, he thought, and so beautiful. When the great house thundered its applause, he was basking in one delicious memory of her. "Last night she had her arm about my neck. Tonight when I call and we are alone, she will kiss me. That beautiful, distinguished creature standing there, bowing and smiling, loves me and no one else. If I were to ask her, she would marry me. If I were in a position and had the means. If I were in a position, that thought cut him, for he knew that he was not. He could not marry her. In reality she would not have him, knowing how little he made, or would she? He wondered. End of section 22. Section 23 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 23. Toward the end of spring Eugene concluded that he would rather go up in the mountains near Christina's bungalow this summer than back to see Angela. The memory of that precious creature was, under the stress and excitement of metropolitan life, becoming a little tarnished. His recollections of her were as delightful as ever, as redolent of beauty, but he was beginning to wonder. The smart crowd in New York was composed of a different type. Angela was sweet and lovely, but would she fit in? Meanwhile, Miriam Finch, with her subtle eclecticism, continued her education of Eugene. She was as good as a school. He would sit and listen to her descriptions of plays, her appreciation of books, her summing up of current philosophies, and he would almost feel himself growing. She knew so many people. She could tell him where to go to see just such and such an important thing. All the startling personalities, the worthwhile preachers, the new actors, somehow, she knew all about them. "Now, Eugene," she would exclaim on seeing him, "you positively must go and see Haydon Boyd in the Signet, or see Elmina Deming in her new dances, or look at the pictures of Winslow Homer that are being shown at Nedler's." She would explain with exactness why she wanted him to see them, what she thought they would do for him. She frankly confessed to him that she considered him a genius, and always insisted on knowing what new thing he was doing. When any work of his appeared and she liked it, she was swift to tell him. He almost felt as if he owned her room and herself, as if all that she was, her ideas, her friends, her experiences, belonged to him. He could go and draw on them by sitting at her feet or going with her somewhere. When spring came, she liked to walk with him, to listen to his comments on nature and life. "That's splendid," she would exclaim. "Now, why don't you write that? Or why don't you paint that?" He showed her some of his poems once, and she made copies of them and pasted them in a book of what she called exceptional things. So he was coddled by her. In another way, Christina was equally nice. She was fond of telling Eugene how much she thought of him, how nice she thought he was. "You're so big and smarty," she said to him once, affectionately, pinioning his arms and looking into his eyes. "I like the way you part your hair, too. You're kind of like an artist ought to be." "That's the way to spoil me," he replied. "Let me tell you how nice you are. Want to know how nice you are?" She smiled, shaking her head to mean no. "Wait till we get to the mountains. I'll tell you." He sealed her lips with his, holding her until her breath was almost gone. "Oh," she exclaimed, "you're terrible. You're like steel." "And you're like a big red rose. Kiss me." From Christina he learned all about the musical world and musical personalities. He gained an insight into the different forms of music, operatic, symphonic, instrumental. He learned of the different forms of composition, the terminology, the mystery of the vocal cords, the methods of training. He learned of the jealousies within the profession and what the best musical authorities thought of such and such composers or singers. He learned how difficult it was to gain a place in the operatic world, how bitterly singers fought each other, how quick the public was to desert a fading star. Christina took it all so unconcernedly that he almost loved her for her courage. She was so wise and so good-natured. "You have to give up a lot of things to be a good artist," she said to Eugene one day. "You can't have the ordinary life and art too." "Just what do you mean, Chrissy?" he asked, petting her hand, for they were alone together. "Why, you can't get married very well and have children, and you can't do much in a social way. Oh, I know they do get married, but sometimes I think it is a mistake. Most of the singers I know don't do very well tied down by marriage." "Don't you intend to get married?" asked Eugene curiously. "I don't know," she replied, realizing what he was driving at. "I'd want to think about that. A woman artist is in a D of a position anyway," using the letter D only to indicate the word devil. "She has so many things to think about." "For instance?" "Oh, what people think, and her family think, and I don't know what all. They ought to get a new sex for artists, like they have for worker bees." Eugene smiled. He knew what she was driving at, but he did not know how long she had been debating the problem of her virginity as conflicting with her love of distinction in art. She was nearly sure she did not want to complicate her art life with marriage. She was almost positive that success on the operatic stage, particularly the great opportunity for the beginner abroad, was complicated with some liaison. Some escaped, but it was not many. She was wondering in her own mind whether she owed it to the current morality to remain absolutely pure. It was assumed generally that girls should remain virtuous and marry, but this did not necessarily apply to her. Should it apply to the artistic temperament? Her mother and her family troubled her. She was virtuous, but youth and desire had given her some bitter moments, and here was Eugene to emphasize it. "It is a difficult problem," he said sympathetically, wondering what she would eventually do. He felt keenly that her attitude in regard to marriage affected his relationship to her. Was she wedded to her art at the expense of love? "It's a big problem," she said, and went to the piano to sing. He half suspected for a little while after this that she might be contemplating some radical step. What, he did not care to say to himself, but he was intensely interested in her problem. This particular freedom of thought astonished him, broadened his horizon. He wondered what his sister Myrtle would think of a girl discussing marriage in this way. That to be or not to be of it, what Sylvia? He wondered if many girls did that. Most of the women he had known seemed to think more logically along these lines than he did. He remembered asking Ruby once whether she didn't think illicit love was wrong, and hearing her reply, "No, some people thought it was wrong, but that didn't make it so to her." Here was another girl with another theory. They talked more of love, and he wondered why she wanted him to come up to Florizel in the summer. She could not be thinking, no, she was too conservative. He began to suspect, though, that she would not marry him, would not marry anyone at present. She merely wanted to be loved for a while, no doubt. May came, and with it the end of Christina's concert work and voice study so far as New York was concerned. She had been in and out of the city all the winter, to Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Chicago, St. Paul, and now, after a winter's hard work, retired to Hagerstown with her mother for a few weeks prior to leaving for Florizel. "You ought to come down here," she wrote to Eugene early in June. "There is a sickle moon that shines in my garden, and the roses are in bloom. Oh, the odors are so sweet, and the dew. Some of our windows open out level with the grass, and I sing, I sing, I sing." He had a notion to run down, but restrained himself, for she told him that they were leaving in 2 weeks for the mountains. He had a set of drawings to complete for a magazine for which they were in a hurry, so he decided to wait till that was done. In late June he went up to the Blue Ridge in southern Pennsylvania, where Florizel was situated. He thought at first he would be invited to stay at the Channing bungalow, but Christina warned him that it would be safer and better for him to stay at one of the adjoining hotels. There were several on the slope of adjacent hills at prices ranging from $5 to $10 a day. Though this was high for Eugene, he decided to go. He wanted to be with this marvelous creature, to see just what she did mean by wishing they were in the mountains together. He had saved some $800, which was in his savings bank, and he withdrew $300 for his little outing. He took Christina a very handsomely bound copy of Villon, of whom she was fond, and several volumes of new verse. Most of these, chosen according to his recent mood, were sad in their poetic texture. They all preached the nothingness of life, its sadness, albeit the perfection of its beauty. At this time Eugene had quite reached the conclusion that there was no hereafter. There was nothing save blind, dark force moving aimlessly, where formerly he had believed vaguely in a heaven and had speculated as to a possible hell. His reading had led him through some main roads and some odd bypaths of logic and philosophy. He was an omnivorous reader now, and a fairly logical thinker. He had already tackled Spencer's First Principles, which had literally torn him up by the roots and set him adrift, and from that had gone back to Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Spinoza, and Schopenhauer, men who ripped out all his private theories and made him wonder what life really was. He had walked the streets for a long time after reading some of these things, speculating on the play of forces, the decay of matter, the fact that thought forms had no more stability than cloud forms. Philosophies came and went, governments came and went, races arose and disappeared. He walked into the great Natural History Museum of New York once to discover enormous skeletons of prehistoric animals, things said to have lived 2, 3, 5 millions of years before his day, and he marveled at the forces which produced them, the indifference, apparently, with which they had been allowed to die. Nature seemed lavish of its types, and utterly indifferent to the persistence of anything. He came to the conclusion that he was nothing, a mere shell, a sound, a leaf which had no general significance, and for the time being it almost broke his heart. It tended to smash his egotism, to tear away his intellectual pride. He wandered about dazed, hurt, moody, like a lost child, but he was thinking persistently. Then came Darwin, Huxley, Tyndall, Lubbock, a whole string of British thinkers who fortified the original conclusions of the others, but showed him a beauty, a formality, a lavishness of form and idea in nature's methods, which fairly transfixed him. He was still reading poets, naturalists, essayists, but he was still gloomy. Life was nothing save dark forces moving aimlessly. The manner in which he applied his thinking to this life was characteristic and individual. To think that beauty should blossom for a little while and disappear forever seemed sad. To think that his life should endure but for 70 years and then be no more was terrible. He and Angela were chance acquaintances, chemical affinities, never to meet again in all time. He and Christina, he and Ruby, he and anyone, a few bright hours were all they could have together, and then would come the great silence, dissolution, and he would never be any more. It hurt him to think of this, but it made him all the more eager to live, to be loved while he was here. If he could only have a lovely girl's arms to shut him in safely always. It was while he was in this mood that he reached Florizel after a long night's ride, and Christina, who was a good deal of a philosopher and thinker herself at times, was quick to notice it. She was waiting at the depot with a dainty little trap of her own to take him for a drive. The trap rolled out the long, soft, yellow, dusty roads. The mountain dew was still in the earth, though, and the dust was heavy with damp and not flying. Green branches of trees hung low over them. Charming vistas came into view at every turn. Eugene kissed her, for there was no one to see, twisting her head to kiss her lips at leisure. "It's a blessed thing this horse is tame, or we'd be in for some accident. What makes you so moody?" she said. "I'm not moody, or am I? I've been thinking a lot of things of late, of you principally." "Do I make you sad?" "From one point of view, yes." "And what is that, sir?" she asked, with an assumption of severity. "You are so beautiful, so wonderful, and life is so short." "You have only 50 years to love me in," she laughed, calculating his age. "Oh, Eugene, what a boy you are! Wait a minute," she added after a pause, drawing the horse to a stop under some trees. "Hold these," she said, offering him the reins. He took them, and she put her arms about his neck. "Now, you silly!" she exclaimed. "I love you, love you, love you. There was never anyone quite like you. Will that help you?" She smiled into his eyes. "Yes," he answered, "but it isn't enough. 70 years isn't enough. Eternity isn't enough of life as it is now." "As it is now," she echoed, and then took the reins, for she felt what he felt, the need of persistent youth and persistent beauty to keep it as it should be, and these things would not stay. End of section 23. Section 24 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 24. The days spent in the mountains were 17 exactly, and during that time with Christina, Eugene reached a curious exaltation of spirit different from anything he had experienced before. In the first place, he had never known a girl like Christina, so beautiful, so perfect physically, so incisive mentally, so full of a fine artistic perception. She was so quick to perceive exactly what he meant. She was so suggestive to him in her own thoughts and feelings. The mysteries of life employed her mind quite as fully as they did his. She thought much of the subtlety of the human body, of its mysterious emotions, of its conscious and subconscious activities and relationships. The passions, the desires, the necessities of life were as a fine tapestry for her mind to contemplate. She had no time to sit down and formulate her thoughts. She did not want to write, but she worked out through her emotions and through her singing the beautiful and pathetic things she felt. And she could talk in a fine poetic melancholy vein on occasion, though there was so much courage and strength in her young blood that she was not afraid of any phase of life or what nature might do with the little substance which she called herself when it should dissolve. "Time and change happeneth to us all," she would quote to Eugene, and he would gravely nod his head. The hotel where he stopped was more pretentious than any he had been previously acquainted with. He had never had so much money in his life before, nor had he ever felt called upon to spend it lavishly. The room he took was, because of what Christina might think, one of the best. He took Christina's suggestion and invited her mother and her brother to dinner on several occasions. The remainder of the family had not arrived yet. In return, he was invited to breakfast, to lunch, and dinner at the bungalow. Christina showed on his arrival that she had planned to be with him alone as much as possible, for she suggested that they make expeditions to High Hill, to Bold Face, and the Chimney, 3 surrounding mountains. She knew of good hotels at 7, 10, and 15 miles distance to which they could go by train, or else they drive and return by moonlight. She had selected 2 or 3 secluded spots in thickets and groves where the trees gave way to little open spaces of grass, and in these they would string a hammock, scatter their books of verse about, and sit down to enjoy the delights of talk and love-making. Under the influence of this companionship, under the cloudless skies, and in the heart of the June weather, Christina finally yielded to an arrangement which brought Eugene into a relationship which he had never dreamed possible with her. They had progressed by degrees through all the subtleties of courtship. They had come to discuss the nature of passion and emotion, and had swept aside as negligible the conviction that there was any inherent evil in the most intimate relationship. At last Christina said frankly, "I don't want to be married. It isn't for me. Not until I've thoroughly succeeded, anyhow. I'd rather wait. If I could just have you and singleness too." "Why do you want to yield yourself to me?" Eugene asked curiously. "I don't know that I exactly want to. I could do with just your love if you were satisfied. It's you that I want to make happy. I want to give you anything you want." "Curious girl," observed her lover, smoothing her high forehead with his hand. "I don't understand you, Christina. I don't know how your mind works. Why should you? You have everything to lose if worst came to worst." "Oh, no," she smiled. "I'd marry you then." "But to do this out of hand because you love me, because you want me to be happy." He paused. "I don't understand it either, honey boy," she offered. "I just do." "But why, if you are willing to do this, you wouldn't prefer to live with me, is what I don't understand." She took his face between her hands. "I think I understand you better than you do yourself. I don't think you'd be happy married. You might not always love me. I might not always love you. You might come to regret. If we could be happy now, you might reach the point where you wouldn't care any more. Then, you see, I wouldn't be remorseful thinking that we had never known happiness." "What logic!" he exclaimed. "Do you mean to say you wouldn't care any more?" "Oh, I'd care, but not in the same way. Don't you see, Eugene? I would have the satisfaction of knowing that even if we did separate, you had had the best of me." It seemed astounding to Eugene that she should talk in this way, reason this way. What a curious, sacrificial, fatalistic turn of mind. Could a young, beautiful, talented girl really be like this? Would anybody on earth really believe it if they knew? He looked at her and shook his head sorrowfully. To think that the quintessence of life should not stay with us always, he sighed. No, honey boy, she replied. You want too much. You think you want it to stay, but you don't. You want it to go. You wouldn't be satisfied to live with me always. I know it. Take what the gods provide and have no regrets. Refuse to think. You can, you know. Eugene gathered her up in his arms. He kissed her over and over, forgetting in her embrace all the loves he had ever known. She yielded herself to him, gladly, joyously, telling him over and over that it made her happy. "If you could only see how nice you are to me, you wouldn't wonder," she explained. He concluded she was the most wonderful being he had ever known. No woman had ever revealed herself to him so unselfishly in love. No woman he had ever known appeared to have the courage and the insight to go thus simply and directly to what she desired. To hear an artist of her power, a girl of her beauty, discussing calmly whether she should sacrifice her virtue to love, whether marriage in the customary form was good for her art, whether she should take him now when they were young, or bow to the conventions and let youth pass, was enough to shock his still trammeled soul. For after all, and despite his desire for personal freedom, his intellectual doubts and mental exceptions still had a profound reverence for a home such as that maintained by Jonathan Blue and his wife, and for its results in the form of normal, healthy, dutiful children. Nature had no doubt attained to this standard through a long series of difficulties and experiments, and she would not readily relinquish it. Was it really necessary to abandon it entirely? Did he want to see a world in which a woman would take him for a little while, as Christina was doing now, and then leave him? His experience here was making him think, throwing his theories and ideas up in the air, making a mess of all the notions he had ever formed about things. He racked his brain over the intricacies of sex and life, sitting on the great verandas of the hotel and wondering over and over just what the answer was, and why he could not, like other men, be faithful to one woman and be happy. He wondered whether this was really so, or whether he could not. It seemed to him then that he might. He knew that he did not understand himself very clearly, that he had no grasp on himself at all as yet, his tendencies, his possibilities. These days under such halcyon conditions made a profound impression on him. He was struck with the perfection life could reach at odd moments. These great quiet hills, so uniform in their roundness, so green, so peaceful, rested his soul. He and Christina climbed one day 2,000 feet to a ledge which jutted out over a valley and commanded what seemed to him the kingdoms and the powers of the earth. Vast stretches of green land and subdivided fields, little cottage settlements and towns, great hills that stood up like friendly brothers to this one in the distance. "See that man down in that yard," said Christina, pointing to a speck of a beam chopping wood in a front space, serving as a garden to a country cottage fully a mile distant. "Where?" asked Eugene. "See where that red barn is, just this side of that clump of trees? Don't you see? There, where the cows are in that field." "I don't see any cows." "Oh, Eugene, what's the matter with your eyes?" "Oh, now I see," he replied, squeezing her fingers. "He looks like a cockroach, doesn't he?" "Yes," she laughed. "How wide the earth is and how small we are. Now think of that speck, with all his hopes and ambitions, all the machinery of his brain and nerves, and tell me whether any God can care. How can he, Christina?" "He can't care for any one particular speck much, sweet. He might care for the idea of man, or a race of men as a whole. Still, I'm not sure, honey. All I know is that I'm happy now." "And I," he echoed. Still they dug at this problem. The question of the origin of life, its why. The tremendous and wearisome age of the earth. The veritable storms of birth and death that seemed to have raged at different periods, held them in discussion. "We can't solve it, Eugene mio," she laughed. "We might as well go home. Poor dear mamma will be wondering where her Christina is. You know I think she suspects that I'm falling in love with you. She doesn't care how many men fall in love with me. But if I show the least sign of a strong preference, she begins to worry." "Have there been many preferences?" he inquired. "No, but don't ask. What difference does it make? Oh, Eugene, what difference does it make? I love you now." "I don't know what difference it makes," he replied. "Only there is an ache that goes with the thought of previous experience. I can't tell you why it is. It just is." She looked thoughtfully away. "Anyhow, no man ever was to me before what you have been. Isn't that enough? Doesn't that speak?" "Yes, yes, sweet, it does. Oh, yes, it does. Forgive me. I won't grieve any more." "Don't, please," she said. "You hurt me as much as you hurt yourself." There were evenings when he sat on some of the great verandas and watched them trim and string the interspaces between the columns with soft glowing Chinese lanterns, preparatory to the evening's dancing. He loved to see the girls and men of the summer colony arrive, the former treading the soft grass in filmy white gowns and white slippers, the latter in white ducks and flannels, gaily chatting as they came. Christina would come to these affairs with her mother and brother, beautifully clad in white linen or lawns and laces, and he would be beside himself with chagrin that he had not practiced dancing to the perfection of the art. He could dance now, but not like her brother or scores of men he saw upon the waxen floor. It hurt him. At times he would sit all alone after his splendid evenings with his love, dreaming of the beauty of it all. The stars would be as a great wealth of diamond seed flung from the lavish hand of an aimless sower. The hills would loom dark and tall. There was peace and quiet everywhere. Why may not life be always like this, he would ask, and then he would answer himself out of his philosophy that it would become deadly after a while, as does all unchanging beauty. The call of the soul is for motion, not peace. Peace after activity for a little while, then activity again. So must it be. He understood that. Just before he left for New York, Christina said to him, "Now, when you see me again, I will be Miss Channing of New York. You will be Mr. Witla. We will almost forget that we were ever here together. We will scarcely believe that we have seen what we have seen and done what we have done." "But, Christina, you talk as though everything were over. It isn't, is it?" "We can't do anything like this in New York," she sighed. "I haven't time, and you must work." There was a shade of finality in her tone. "Oh, Christina, don't talk so. I can't think that way. Please don't." "I won't," she said. "We'll see. Wait till I get back." He kissed her a dozen farewells, and at the door held her close once more. "Will you forsake me?" he asked. "No, you will forsake me. But remember, dear, don't you see? You've had all. Let me be your wood nymph. The rest is commonplace." He went back to his hotel with an ache in his heart, for he knew they had gone through all they ever would. She had had her summer with him. She had given him of herself fully. She wanted to be free to work now. He could not understand it, but he knew it to be so. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 25. It is a rather dreary thing to come back into the hot city in the summer after a period of beauty in the mountains. The quiet of the hills was in Eugene's mind. The glisten and babble of mountain streams, the soar and poise of hawks and buzzards and eagles sailing the crystal blue. He felt lonely and sick for a while, out of touch with work and with practical life generally. There were little souvenirs of his recent happiness in the shape of letters and notes from Christina, but he was full of the premonition of the end which had troubled him on leaving. He must write to Angela. He had not thought of her all the time he had been gone. He had been in the habit of writing to her every third or fourth day at least, while of late his letters had been less passionate they had remained fairly regular. But now this sudden break coming, it was fully 3 weeks, which made her think he must be ill, although she had begun to feel also that he might be changing. His letters had grown steadily less reminiscent of the joys they had experienced together and of the happiness they were anticipating, and more inclined to deal with the color and character of city life and of what he hoped to achieve. Angela was inclined to excuse much of this on the grounds of the special effort he was making to achieve distinction and a living income for themselves. But it was hard to explain 3 weeks of silence without something quite serious having happened. Eugene understood this. He tried to explain it on the grounds of illness, stating that he was now up and feeling much better. But when his explanation came, it had the hollow ring of insincerity. Angela wondered what the truth could be. Was he yielding to the temptation of that looser life that all artists were supposed to lead? She wondered and worried, for time was slipping away and he was setting no definite date for their much discussed nuptials. The trouble with Angela's position was that the delay involved practically everything which was important in her life. She was 5 years older than Eugene. She had long since lost that atmosphere of youth and buoyancy which is so characteristic of a girl between 18 and 22. Those few short years following, when the body of maidenhood blooms like a rose, and there is about it the freshness and color of all rich, new, lush life, were behind her. Ahead was that persistent decline towards something harder, shrewder, and less beautiful. In the case of some persons, the decline is slow, and the fragrance of youth lingers for years, the artifices of the dressmaker, the chemist, and the jeweler being but little needed. In others it is fast, and no contrivance will stay the ravages of a restless, eager, dissatisfied soul. Sometimes art combines with slowness of decay to make a woman of almost perennial charm, loveliness of mind, matching loveliness of body, and taste and tact supplementing both. Angela was fortunate in being slow to fade, and she had a loveliness of imagination and emotion to sustain her. But she had also a restless, anxious disposition of mind, which, if it had not been stayed by the kindly color of her home life, and by the fortunate or unfortunate intervention of Eugene at a time when she considered her ideal of love to have fairly passed out of the range of possibility, would already have set on her face the signs of old maidenhood. She was not of the newer order of femininity, eager to get out in the world and follow some individual line of self-development and interest. Rather, she was a home woman, wanting some one man to look after and love. The wonder and beauty of her dream of happiness with Eugene now made the dangers of its loss and the possible compulsory continuance of a humdrum, underpaid, backwoods existence heart-sickening. Meanwhile, as the summer passed, Eugene was casually enlarging his acquaintance with women. McHugh and Smite had gone back home for the summer, and it was a relief from his loneliness to encounter one day in an editorial office Norma Whitmore, a dark, keen, temperamental, and moody but brilliant writer and editor who, like others before her, took a fancy to Eugene. She was introduced to him by Jans Jansen, art director of the paper, and after some light banter she offered to show him her office. She led the way to a little room no larger than 6 by 8, where she had her desk. Eugene noticed that she was lean and sallow, about his own age or older, and brilliant and vivacious. Her hands took his attention, for they were thin, shapely, and artistic. Her eyes burned with a peculiar luster, and her loose-fitting clothes were draped artistically about her. A conversation sprang up as to his work, which she knew and admired, and he was invited to her apartment. He looked at Norma with an unconsciously speculative eye. Christina was out of the city, but the memory of her made it impossible for him to write to Angela in his old vein of devotion. Nevertheless, he still thought of her as charming. He thought that he ought to write more regularly. He thought that he ought pretty soon to go back and marry her. He was approaching the point where he could support her in a studio if they lived economically, but he did not want to exactly. He had known her now for 3 years. It was fully a year and a half since he had seen her last. In the last year his letters had been less and less about themselves and more about everything else. He was finding the conventional love letters difficult, but he did not permit himself to realize just what that meant, to take careful stock of his emotions. That would have compelled him to the painful course of deciding that he could not marry her and asking her to be released from his promise. He did not want to do that. Instead, he parleyed, held by pity for her passing youth and her undeniable affection for him, by a sense of the unfairness of having taken up so much of her time to the exclusion of every other person who might have proposed to her, by sorrow for the cruelty of her position in being left to explain to her family that she had been jilted. He hated to hurt any person's feelings. He did not want to be conscious of the grief of any person who had come to suffering through him, and he could not make them suffer very well and not be conscious. He was too tender-hearted. He had pledged himself to Angela, giving her a ring, begging her to wait, writing her fulsome letters of protest and desire. Now, after 3 years, to shame her before her charming family, old Jotham, her mother, her sisters and brothers, it seemed a cruel thing to do, and he did not care to contemplate it. Angela, with her morbid, passionate, apprehensive nature, did not fail to see disaster looming in the distance. She loved Eugene passionately, and the pent-up fires of her nature had been waiting all these years the warrant to express their ardor which marriage alone could confer. Eugene, by the charm of his manner and person, no less than by the sensuous character of some of his moods, and the subtleties and refinements of his references to the ties of sex, had stirred her to anticipate a perfect fruition of her dreams, and she was now eager for that fruition almost to the point of being willing to sacrifice virginity itself. The remembrance of the one significant scene between her and Eugene tormented her. She felt that if his love was to terminate in indifference now, it would have been better to have yielded then. She wished that she had not tried to save herself. Perhaps there would have been a child, and he would have been true to her out of a sense of sympathy and duty. At least, she would have had that crowning glory of womanhood, ardent union with her lover, and if worse had come to worst, she could have died. She thought of the quiet little lake near her home, its glassy bosom a mirror to the sky, and how, in case of failure, she would have looked lying on its sandy bottom, her pale hair diffused by some aimless motion of the water, her eyes sealed by the end of consciousness, her hands folded. Her fancy outran her daring. She would not have done this, but she could dream about it, and it made her distress all the more intense. As time went by and Eugene's ardor did not revive, this problem of her love became more harassing, and she began to wonder seriously what she could do to win him back to her. He had expressed such a violent desire for her on his last visit, had painted his love in such glowing terms, that she felt convinced he must love her still, though absence and the excitements of city life had dimmed the memory of her temporarily. She remembered a line in a comic opera which she and Eugene had seen together. Absence is the dark room in which lovers develop negatives. And this seemed the case in point. If she could get him back, if he could be near her again, his old fever would develop, and she would then find some way of making him take her, perhaps. It did not occur to her quite clearly just how this could be done at this time, but some vague notion of self-immolation was already stirring vaguely and disturbingly in her brain. The trying and in some way disheartening conditions of her home went some way to sustain this notion. Her sister Marietta was surrounded by a score of suitors who were as eager for her love as a bee is for the honey of a flower, and Angela could see that they were already looking upon herself as an elderly chaperone. Her mother and father watched her going about her work, and grieved because so good a girl should be made to suffer for want of proper understanding. She could not conceal her feelings entirely, and they could see at times that she was unhappy. She could see that they saw it. It was hard to have to explain to her sisters and brothers, who occasionally asked after Eugene, that he was doing all right, and never be able to say that he was coming for her some day soon. At first Marietta had been envious of her. She thought she would like to win Eugene for herself, and only consideration for Angela's age and the fact that she had not been so much sought after had deterred her. Now that Eugene was obviously neglecting her, or at least delaying beyond any reasonable point, she was deeply sorry. Once, before she had grown into the age of courtship, she had said to Angela, "I'm going to be nice to men. You're too cold. You'll never get married." And Angela had realized that it was not a matter of too cold, but an innate prejudice against most of the types she met. And then the average man did not take to her. She could not spur herself to pleasure in their company. It took a fire like Eugene's to stir her mightily, and once having known that she could brook no other. Marietta realized this too. Now, because of these 3 years, she had cut herself off from other men, particularly the one who had been most attentive to her, faithful Victor Dean. The one thing that might save Angela from being completely ignored was a spirit of romance which kept her young in looks as in feelings. With the fear of desertion in her mind, Angela began to hint in her letters to Eugene that he should come back to see her, to express the hope in her letters that their marriage need not, because of any difficulty of establishing himself, be postponed much longer. She said to him over and over that she could be happy with him in a cottage, and that she so longed to see him again. Eugene began to ask himself what he wanted to do. The fact that on the passionate side Angela appealed to him more than any woman he had ever known was a saving point in her favor at this juncture. There was a note in her make-up which was stronger, deeper, more suggestive of joy to come than anything he had found elsewhere. He remembered keenly the wonderful days he had spent with her, the one significant night when she begged him to save her against herself, all the beauty of the season with which she was surrounded at the time, the charm of her family, the odor of flowers and the shade of trees served to make a setting for her delightfulness which still endured with him as fresh as yesterday. Now, without having completed that romance, a very perfect flower, could he cast it aside? At this time he was not entangled with any woman. Miriam Finch was too conservative and intellectual. Norma Whitmore not attractive enough. As for some other charming examples of femininity whom he had met here and there, he had not been drawn to them or they to him. Emotionally he was lonely, and this for him was always a very susceptible mood. He could not make up his mind that the end had come with Angela. It so happened that Marietta, after watching her sister's love affair some time, reached the conclusion that she ought to try to help her. Angela was obviously concealing a weariness of heart which was telling on her peace of mind and her sweetness of disposition. She was unhappy, and it grieved her sister greatly. The latter loved her in a whole-hearted way, in spite of the fact that their affections might possibly have clashed over Eugene, and she thought once of writing in a sweet way and telling him how things were. She thought he was good and kind, that he loved Angela, that perhaps he was delaying, as her sister said, until he should have sufficient means to marry well, and that if the right word were said now, he would cease chasing a phantom fortune long enough to realize that it were better to take Angela while they were still young than to wait until they were so old that the romance of marriage would for them be over. She revolved this in her mind a long time, picturing to herself how sweet Angela really was, and finally nerved herself to pen the following letter, which she sent: Dear Eugene, you will be surprised to get a letter from me, and I want you to promise me that you will never say anything about it to anyone, above all, never to Angela. Eugene, I have been watching her for a long time now, and I know she is not happy. She is so desperately in love with you. I notice when a letter does not come promptly she is downcast, and I can't help seeing that she is longing to have you here with her. Eugene, why don't you marry Angela? She is lovely and attractive now, and she is as good as she is beautiful. She doesn't want to wait for a fine house and luxuries. No girl wants to do that, Eugene, when she loves, as I know Angela does you. She would rather have you now, when you are both young and can enjoy life, than any fine house or nice things you might give her later. Now, I haven't talked to her at all, Eugene, never one word. And I know it would hurt her terribly if she thought I had written to you. She would never forgive me, but I can't help it. I can't bear to see her grieving and longing. And I know that when you know, you will come and get her. Don't ever indicate in any way, please, that I wrote to you. Don't write to me unless you want to very much. I would rather you didn't. And tear up this letter. But do come for her soon, Eugene. Please do. She wants you. And she will make you a perfectly wonderful wife, for she is a wonderful girl. We all love her so, Papa and Mama and all. I hope you will forgive me. I can't help it. With love, I am yours, Marietta. When Eugene received this letter he was surprised and astonished, but also distressed for himself and Angela and Marietta and the whole situation. The tragedy of this situation appealed to him perhaps as much from the dramatic as from the personal point of view. Little Angela, with her yellow hair and classic face. What a shame they could not be together as she wished, as really in a way he wished. She was beautiful, no doubt of that, and there was a charm about her which was as alluring as that of any girl barring the intellectually exceptional. Her emotions in a way were deeper than those of Marion Finch and Christina Channing. She could not reason about them, that was all. She just felt them. He saw all the phases of her anguish, the probable attitude of her parents, her own feelings at being looked at by them, the way her friends wondered. It was a shame, no doubt of that, a cruel situation. Perhaps he had better go back. He could be happy with her. They could live in a studio, and no doubt things would work out all right. Had he better be cruel and not go? He hated to think of it. Anyhow, he did not answer Marietta's letter, and he did tear it up into 1,000 bits as she requested. If Angela knew, no doubt she would feel wretched, he thought. In the meanwhile, Angela was thinking, and her brooding led her to the conclusion that it might be advisable, if ever her lover came back, to yield herself in order that he might feel compelled to take her. She was no reasoner about life in any big sense. Her judgment of affairs was more confused at this time than at a later period. She had no clear conception of how foolish any trickery of this sort would be. She loved Eugene, felt that she must have him, felt that she would be willing to die rather than lose him, and the thought of trickery came only as a last resource. If he refused her, she was determined on one thing, the lake. She would quit this dreary world where love was crossed with despair in its finest moments. She would forget it all. If only there were rest and silence on the other side, that would be enough. The year moved on toward spring, and because of some note of this, reiterated in pathetic phrases, he came to feel that he must go back. Marietta's letter preyed on his mind. The intensity of Angela's attitude made him feel that something desperate would happen. He could not, in cold blood, sit down and write her that he would not see her any more. The impressions of Blackwood were too fresh in his mind, the summer incense and green beauty of the world in which she lived. He wrote in April that he would come again in June, and Angela was beside herself with joy. One of the things which helped Eugene to this conclusion was the fact that Christina Channing was not coming back from Europe that year. She had written a few times during the winter, but very guardedly. A casual reader could not have drawn from what she said that there had ever been anything between them. He had written much more ardently, of course, but she had chosen to ignore his eager references, making him feel by degrees that he was not to know much of her in the future. They were going to be good friends, but not necessarily lovers, nor eventually husband and wife. It irritated him to think she could be so calm about a thing which to him seemed so important. It hurt his pride to think that she could so deliberately throw him over. Finally, he began to be incensed, and then Angela's fidelity appeared in a much finer light. There was a girl who would not treat him so. She really loved him. She was faithful and true. So his promised trip began to look much more attractive, and by June he was in a fever to see her. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 26. The beautiful June weather arrived, and with it Eugene took his departure once more for Blackwood. He was in a peculiar mood. For while he was anxious to see Angela again, it was with the thought that perhaps he was making a mistake. A notion of fatality was beginning to run through his mind. Perhaps he was destined to take her, and yet, could anything be more ridiculous? He could decide. He had deliberately decided to go back there, or had he? He admitted to himself that his passion was drawing him. In fact, he could not see that there was anything much in love outside of passion. Desire? Wasn't that all that pulled two people together? There was some little charm of personality above that, but desire was the keynote. And if the physical attraction were strong enough, wasn't that sufficient to hold two people together? Did you really need so much more? It was logic based on youth, enthusiasm, and inexperience, but it was enough to hold him for the time being, to soothe him. To Angela he was not drawn by any of the things which drew him to Miriam Finch and Norma Whitmore, nor was there the wonderful art of Christina Channing. Still he was going. His interest in Norma Whitmore had increased greatly as the winter passed. In this woman he had found an intellect as broadening and refining as any he had encountered. Her taste for the exceptional in literature and art was as great as that of anyone he had ever known, and it was just as individual. She ran to impressive, realistic fiction in literature, and to the kind of fresh from the soil art which Eugene represented. Her sense of just how big and fresh was the thing he was trying to do was very encouraging. And she was carrying the word about town to all her friends that he was doing it. She had even gone so far as to speak to two different art dealers, asking them why they had not looked into what seemed to her his perfectly wonderful drawings. "Why, they're astonishing in their newness," she told Eberhard Zang, one of the important picture dealers on Fifth Avenue. She knew him from having gone there to borrow pictures for reproduction. "Witla, Witla," he commented, in his conservative German way, rubbing his chin. "I don't remember seeing anything by him." "Of course you don't," replied Norma persistently. "He's new. I tell you, he hasn't been here so very long. You get Truth for some week in last month, I forget which one, and see that picture of Greeley Square. It will show you what I mean." "Witla, Witla," repeated Zang, much as a parrot might fix a sound in its memory. "Tell him to come in here and see me some day. I should like to see some of his things." "I will," said Norma genially. She was anxious to have Eugene go, but he was more anxious to get a lot of things done before he had an exhibition. He did not want to risk an impression with anything short of a rather extensive series, and his collection of views was not complete at that time. Beside, he had a much more significant art dealer in mind. He and Norma had reached the point by this time where they were like brother and sister, or better yet, two good men friends. He would slip his arm about her waist when entering her rooms, and was free to hold her hands or pat her on the arm or shoulder. There was nothing more than strong good feeling on his part, while on hers a burning affection might have been inspired. But his genial, brotherly attitude convinced her that it was useless. He had never told her of any of his other women friends, and he was wondering as he rode west how she and Miriam Finch would take his marriage with Angela, supposing that he ever did marry her. As for Christina Channing, he did not want to think, really did not dare to think of her very much. Some sense of lost beauty came to him out of that experience, a touch of memory that had a pang in it. Chicago in June was just a little dreary to him, with its hurry of life, its breath of past experience, the Art Institute, the Daily Globe building, the street and house in which Ruby had lived. He wondered about her, as he had before, the moment he neared the city, and had a strong desire to go and look her up. Then he visited the Globe offices, but Matthews had gone. Genial, cheerful Jerry had moved to Philadelphia recently, taken a position on the Philadelphia North American, leaving Hal alone, more finicky and picayune than ever. Goldfarb, of course, was gone, and Eugene felt out of it. He was glad to take the train for Blackwood, for he felt lonesome. He left the city with quite an ache for old times in his heart, and the feeling that life was a jumble of meaningless, strange, and pathetic things. To think that we should grow old, he pondered, that things that were as real as these things were to me should become mere memories. The time just before he reached Blackwood was one of great emotional stress for Angela. Now she was to learn whether he really loved her as much as he had. She was to feel the joy of his presence, the subtle influence of his attitude. She was to find whether she could hold him or not. Marietta, who on hearing that he was coming had rather plumed herself that her letter had had something to do with it, was afraid that her sister would not make good use of this opportune occasion. She was anxious that Angela should look her best, and made suggestions as to things she might wear, games she might play. They had installed tennis and croquet as part of the home pleasure since he had been there last, and places they might go to. Marietta was convinced that Angela was not artful enough, not sufficiently subtle in her presentation of her charms. He could be made to feel very keen about her if she dressed right and showed herself to the best advantage. Marietta herself intended to keep out of the way as much as possible when Eugene arrived, and to appear at great disadvantage in the matter of dress and appearance when seen, for she had become a perfect beauty, and was a breaker of hearts without conscious effort. "You know that string of coral beads I have, Angel Face?" she asked Angela one morning, some 10 days before Eugene arrived. "Wear them with that tan linen dress of mine and your tan shoes some day for Eugene. You'll look stunning in those things, and he'll like you. Why don't you take the new buggy and drive over to Blackwood to meet him? That's it, you must meet him." "Oh, I don't think I want to, Babyette," she replied. She was afraid of this first impression. She did not want to appear to run after him. Babyette was a nickname which had been applied to Marietta in childhood and had never been dropped. "Oh, pshaw, Angel Face, don't be so backward. You're the shyest thing I know. Why, that's nothing. He'll like you all the better for treating him just a little smartly. You do that now, will you?" "I can't," replied Angela. "I can't do it that way. Let him come over here first, then I'll drive him over some afternoon." "Oh, Angel Face! Well, anyhow, when he comes, you must wear that little rose-flowered house dress, and put a wreath of green leaves in your hair." "Oh, I won't do anything of the sort, Babyette!" exclaimed Angela. "Yes, you will," replied her sister. "Now you just have to do what I tell you for once. That dress looks beautiful on you, and the wreath will make it perfect." "It isn't the dress. I know that's nice. It's the wreath." Marietta was incensed by this bit of pointless reserve. "Oh, Angela," she exclaimed, "don't be so silly. You're older than I am, but I know more about men in a minute than you'll ever know. Don't you want him to like you? You'll have to be more daring. Goodness, lots of girls would go a lot farther than that." She caught her sister about the waist and looked into her eyes. "Now, you've got to wear it," she added finally, and Angela understood that Marietta wanted her to entice Eugene by any means in her power to make him declare himself finally and set a definite date or take her back to New York with him. There were other conversations in which a trip to the lake was suggested, games of tennis, with Angela wearing her white tennis suit and shoes, a country dance which might be got up. There were rumors of one to be given in the new barn of a farmer some 7 miles away. Marietta was determined that Angela should appear youthful, gay, active, just the things which she knew instinctively would fascinate Eugene. Finally Eugene came. He arrived at Blackwood at noon. Despite her objections, Angela met him, dressed smartly and, as urged by Marietta, carrying herself with an air. She hoped to impress Eugene with a sense of independence. But when she saw him stepping down from the train in belted corduroy traveling suit, with a gray English traveling cap, carrying a green leather bag of the latest design, her heart misgave her. He was so worldly now, so experienced. You could see by his manner that this country place meant little or nothing to him. He had tasted of the world at large. Angela had stayed in her buggy at the end of the depot platform, and she soon caught Eugene's eye and waved to him. He came briskly forward. "Why, sweet!" he exclaimed. "Here you are! How nice you look!" He jumped up beside her, surveying her critically, and she could feel his examining glance. After the first pleasant impression, he sensed the difference between his new world and hers, and was a little depressed by it. She was a little older, no doubt of that. You cannot hope and yearn and worry for 3 years and not show it. And yet she was fine and tender and sympathetic and emotional. He felt all this. It hurt him a little for her sake and his too. "Well, how have you been?" he asked. They were in the confines of the village and no demonstration could be made. Until the quiet of a country road could be reached, all had to be formal. "Oh, just the same, Eugene. Longing to see you." She looked into his eyes, and he felt the impact of that emotional force which governed her when she was near him. There was something in the chemistry of her being which roused to blazing the ordinary dormant forces of his sympathies. She tried to conceal her real feeling, to pretend gaiety and enthusiasm. But her eyes betrayed her. Something roused in him now at her look, a combined sense of emotion and desire. "It's so fine to be out in the country again," he said, pressing her hand, for he was letting her drive. "After the city, to see you and the green fields." He looked about at the little one-story cottages, each with a small plot of grass, a few trees, a neat confining fence. After New York and Chicago, a village like this was quaint. "Do you love me just as much as ever?" She nodded her head. They reached a strip of yellow road. He asked after her father, her mother, her brothers and sisters, and when he saw that they were unobserved, he slipped his arm about her and drew her head to him. "Now we can," he said. She felt the force of his desire, but she missed that note of adoration which had seemed to characterize his first love-making. How true it was! He had changed. He must have. The city had made her seem less significant. It hurt her to think that life should treat her so, but perhaps she could win him back, could hold him anyhow. They drove over toward Oconee, the little crossroads settlement near a small lake of the same name, a place which was close to the Blue House, and which the Blues were wont to speak of as home. On the way Eugene learned that her youngest brother, David, was a cadet at West Point now and doing splendidly. Samuel had become Western freight agent for the Great Northern and was on his way to a desirable promotion. Benjamin had completed his law studies and was practicing in Racine. He was interested in politics and was going to run for the state legislature. Marietta was still the gay, carefree girl she had always been, not at all inclined to choose yet among her many anxious suitors. Eugene thought of her letter to him, wondered if she would look her thoughts into his eyes when he saw her. "Oh, Marietta," Angela replied when Eugene asked after her. "She's just as dangerous as ever. She makes all the men make love to her." Eugene smiled. Marietta was always a pleasing thought to him. He wished for the moment that it was Marietta instead of Angela that he was coming to see. She was as shrewd as she was kind in this instant. Her appearance on meeting Eugene was purposely indifferent and her attitude anything but coaxing and gay. At the same time she suffered a genuine pang of feeling, for Eugene appealed to her. If it were anybody but Angela, she thought, how she would dress and how quickly she would be coquetting with him. Then his love would be won by her, and she felt that she could hold it. She had great confidence in her ability to keep any man, and Eugene was a man she would have delighted to hold. As it was, she kept out of his way, took sly glances at him here and there, wondered if Angela would truly win him. She was so anxious for Angela's sake. Never, never, she told herself, would she cross her sister's path. At the Blue homestead he was received as cordially as before. After an hour it quite brought back the feeling of 3 years before. These open fields, this old house, and its lovely lawn, all served to awaken the most poignant sensations. One of Marietta's beaux, over from Waukesha, appeared after Eugene had greeted Mrs. Blue and Marietta, and the latter had persuaded him to play a game of tennis with Angela. She invited Eugene to make it a four with her, but not knowing how, he refused. Angela changed to her tennis suit, and Eugene opened his eyes to her charms. She was very attractive on the court, quick, flushed, laughing. And when she laughed, she had a charming way of showing her even small white teeth. She quite awakened a feeling of interest, she looked so dainty and frail. When he saw her afterward in the dark, quiet parlor, he gathered her to his heart with much of the old ardor. She felt the quick change of feeling. Marietta was right. Eugene loved gaiety and color. Although on the way home she had despaired, this was much more promising. Eugene rarely entered on anything half-heartedly. If interested at all, he was greatly interested. He could so yield himself to the glamour of a situation as to come finally to believe that he was something which he was not. Thus now he was beginning to accept this situation as Angela and Marietta wished he should, and to see her in somewhat the old light. He overlooked things which in his New York studio, surrounded by the influences which there modified his judgment, he would have seen. Angela was not young enough for him. She was not liberal in her views. She was charming, no doubt of that, but he could not bring her to an understanding of his casual acceptance of life. She knew nothing of his real disposition, and he did not tell her. He played the part of a seemingly single-minded Romeo, and as such he was from a woman's point of view beautiful to contemplate. In his own mind he was coming to see that he was fickle, but he still did not want to admit it to himself. There was a night of stars after an evening of June perfection. At 5 old Jotham came in from the fields, as dignified and patriarchal as ever. He greeted Eugene with a hearty handshake, for he admired him. "I see some of your work now and then," he said, "in these monthly magazines. It's fine. There's a young minister down here near the lake that's very anxious to meet you. He likes to get hold of anything you do, and I always send him the books down as soon as Angela gets through with them." He used the word books and magazines interchangeably, and spoke as though they were not much more important to him than the leaves of the trees, as indeed they were not. To a mind used to contemplating the succession of crops and seasons, all life, with its multitudinous interplay of shapes and forms, seemed passing shadows. Even men were like leaves that fall. Eugene was drawn to old Jotham as a filing to a magnet. He was just the type of mind that appealed to him, and Angela gained by the radiant glory of her father. If he was so wonderful, she must be something above the average of womanhood. Such a man could not help but produce exceptional children. Left alone together, it was hardly possible for Angela and Eugene not to renew the old relationship on the old basis. Having gone as far as he had the first time, it was natural that he should wish to go as far again and further. After dinner, when she turned to him from her room, arrayed in a soft evening dress of clinging texture, somewhat low in the neck by request of Marietta, who had helped her to dress, Eugene was conscious of her emotional perturbation. He himself was distraught, for he did not know what he would do, how far he would dare to trust himself. He was always troubled when dealing with his physical passion, for it was a raging lion at times. It seemed to overcome him quite as a drug might or a soporific fume. He would mentally resolve to control himself, but unless he instantly fled there was no hope, and he did not seem able to run away. He would linger and parley, and in a few moments it was master, and he was following its behest blindly, desperately, to the point almost of exposure and destruction. Tonight when Angela came back he was cogitating, wondering what it might mean. Should he? Would he marry her? Could he escape? They sat down to talk, but presently he drew her to him. It was the old story, moment after moment of increasing feeling. Presently she, from the excess of longing and waiting, was lost to all sense of consideration, and he... "I shall have to go away, Eugene," she pleaded, when he carried her recklessly into his room. "If anything happens, I cannot stay here." "Don't talk," he said. "You can come to me." "You mean it, Eugene, surely?" she begged. "As sure as I'm holding you here," he replied. At midnight Angela lifted frightened, wondering, doubting eyes, feeling herself the most depraved creature. Two pictures were in her mind alternately, with a pendulum-like reiteration. One was a composite of a marriage altar and a charming New York studio with friends coming in to see them, as much as he had often described to her. The other was of the still blue waters of Okoonee, with herself lying there pale and still. Yes, she would die if he did not marry her now. Life would not be worth while. She would not force him. She would slip out some night when it was too late and all hope had been abandoned, when exposure was near, and the next day they would find her. Little Marietta, how she would cry, and old Jotham. She could see him, but he would never really be sure of the truth. And her mother, oh God in heaven, she thought, how hard life is, how terrible it can be. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 27. The atmosphere of the house after this night seemed charged with reproach to Eugene, although it took on no semblance of reality in either look or word. When he awoke in the morning and looked through the half-closed shutters to the green world outside, he felt a sense of freshness and of shame. It was cruel to come into such a home as this and do a thing as mean as he had done. After all, philosophy or no philosophy, didn't a fine old citizen like Jotham, honest, upright, genuine in his moral point of view and his observance of the golden rule, didn't he deserve better from a man whom he so sincerely admired? Jotham had been so nice to him. Their conversations together were so kindly and sympathetic. Eugene felt that Jotham believed him to be an honest man. He knew he had that appearance. He was frank, genial, considerate, not willing to condemn anyone. But this sex question, that was where he was weak. And was not the whole world keyed to that? Did not the decencies and the sanities of life depend on right moral conduct? Was not the world dependent on how the homes were run? How could anyone be good if his mother and father had not been good before him? How could the children of the world expect to be anything if people rushed here and there holding illicit relations? Take his sister Myrtle now. Would he have wanted her rifled in this manner? In the face of this question he was not ready to say exactly what he wanted or was willing to countenance. Myrtle was a free agent, as was every other girl. She could do as she pleased. It might not please him exactly, but he went round and round from one problem to another, trying to untie this Gordian knot. One thing, this home had appeared sweet and clean when he came into it. Now it was just a little tarnished, and by him. Or was it? His mind was always asking this question. There was nothing that he was actually accepting as true any more. He was going round in a ring asking questions of this proposition and that. Are you true? And are you true? And all the while he was apparently not getting anywhere. It puzzled him, this life. Sometimes it shamed him. This deed shamed him, and he asked himself whether he was wrong to be ashamed or not. Perhaps he was just foolish. Was not life made for living, not worrying? He had not created his passions and desires. He threw open the shutters, and there was the bright day. Everything was so green outside, the flowers in bloom, the trees casting a cool, lovely shade, the birds twittering. Bees were humming. He could smell the lilacs. Dear God, he exclaimed, throwing his arms above his head. How lovely life is! How beautiful! Oh! He drew in a deep breath of the flower and privet-laden air. If only he could live always like this, forever and ever. When he had sponged himself with cold water and dressed, putting on a soft negligee shirt with turned-down collar and dark flowing tie, he issued forth clean and fresh. Angela was there to greet him. Her face was pale, but she looked intensely sweet because of her sadness. There, there, he said, touching her chin. Less of that now. I told them I had a headache, she said. So I have. Do you understand? I understand your headache, he laughed. But everything is all right, very much all right. Isn't this a lovely day? Beautiful, replied Angela sadly. Cheer up, he insisted. Don't worry. Everything is coming out fine. He walked to the window and stared out. I'll have your breakfast ready in a minute, she said, and pressing his hand, left him. Eugene went out to the hammock. He was so deliciously content and joyous now that he saw the green world about him, that he felt everything was all right again. The vigorous blooming forces of nature everywhere present belied the sense of evil and decay to which mortality is so readily subject. He felt that everything was justified in youth and love, particularly where mutual affection reigned. Why should he not take Angela? Why should they not be together? He went in to breakfast at her call, eating comfortably of the things she provided. He felt the easy familiarity and graciousness of the conqueror. Angela, on her part, felt the fear and uncertainty of one who has embarked upon a dangerous voyage. She had set sail whither? At what port would she land? Was it the lake or his studio? Would she live and be happy, or would she die to face a black uncertainty? Was there a hell, as some preachers insisted? Was there a gloomy place of lost souls, such as the poets described? She looked into the face of this same world which Eugene found so beautiful, and its very beauty trembled with forebodings of danger. And there were days and days yet to be lived of this. For all her fear, once having tasted of the forbidden fruit, it was sweet and inviting. She could not go near Eugene, nor he near her, but this flush of emotion would return. In the daylight she was too fearful, but when the night came, with its stars, its fresh winds, its urge to desire, her fears could not stand in their way. Eugene was insatiable, and she was yearning. The slightest touch was as of fire to tow. She yielded, saying she would not yield. The Blue family were of course blissfully ignorant of what was happening. It seemed so astonishing to Angela at first that the very air did not register her actions in some visible way. That they should be able thus to be alone was not so remarkable, seeing that Eugene's courtship was being aided and abetted for her sake, but that her lapse should not be exposed by some sinister influence seemed strange, accidental, and subtly ominous. Something would happen, that was her fear. She had not the courage of her desire or need. By the end of the week, though Eugene was less ardent and more or less oppressed by the seeming completeness with which she had conquered, he was not ready to leave. He was sorry to go, for it ended a honeymoon of sweetness and beauty, all the more wonderful and enchanting because so clandestine. Yet he was beginning to be aware that he had bound himself in chains of duty and responsibility. Angela had thrown herself on his mercy and his sense of honor to begin with. She had exacted a promise of marriage, not urgently, as one who sought to entrap him, but with the explanation that otherwise life must end in disaster for her. Eugene could look in her face and see that it would. And now that he had had his way and plumbed the depths of her emotions and desires, he had a higher estimate of her personality. Despite the fact that she was older than he, there was a breath of youth and beauty here that held him. Her body was exquisite. Her feeling about life and love was tender and beautiful. He wished he could make true her dreams of bliss without injury to himself. It so turned out that as his visit was drawing to a close, Angela decided that she ought to go to Chicago, for there were purchases which must be made. Her mother wanted her to go, and she decided that she would go with Eugene. This made the separation easier, gave them more time to talk. Her usual plan was to stay with her aunt, and she was going there now. On the way she asked over and over what he would think of her in the future, whether what had passed would not lower her in his eyes. He did not feel that it would. Once she said to him sadly, "Only death or marriage can help me now." "What do you mean?" he asked, her yellow head pillowed on his shoulder, her dark blue eyes looking sadly into his. "That if you don't marry me I'll have to kill myself. I can't stay at home." He thought of her with her beautiful body, her mass of soft hair all tarnished in death. "You wouldn't do that?" he asked unbelievingly. "Yes, I would," she said sadly. "I must. I will." "Hush, Angel Face," he pleaded. "You won't do anything like that. You won't have to. I'll marry you. How would you do it?" "Oh, I've thought it all out," she continued gloomily. "You know that little lake? I'd drown myself." "Don't, sweetheart," he pleaded. "Don't talk that way. It's terrible. You won't have to do anything like that." To think of her under the waters of little Okoonee, with its green banks and yellow sandy shores. All her love come to this? All her passion? Her death would be upon his head, and he could not stand the thought of that. It frightened him. Such tragedies occasionally appeared in the papers, with all the pathetic details convincingly set forth, but this should not enter his life. He would marry her. She was lovely after all. He would have to. He might as well make up his mind to that now. He began to speculate how soon it might be. For the sake of her family, she wanted no secret marriage, but one which, if they could not be present at it, they could at least know was taking place. She was willing to come East. That could be arranged. But they must be married. Eugene realized the depth of her conventional feelings so keenly that it never occurred to him to suggest an alternative. She would not consent, would scorn him for it. The only alternative, she appeared to believe, was death. One evening, the last, when it was necessary for her to return to Blackwood, and he had seen her off on the train, her face a study in sadness, he rode out gloomily to Jackson Park, where he had once seen a beautiful lake in the moonlight. When he reached there, the waters of the lake were still, suffused, and tinged with lovely suggestions of lavender, pink, and silver, for this was near the 21st of June. The trees to the east and west were dark. The sky showed a last blush of orange. Odors were about, warm June fragrance. He thought now, as he walked about the quiet paths, where the sand and pebbles crunched lightly beneath his feet, of all the glory of this wonderful week. How dramatic was life! How full of romance! This love of Angela's, how beautiful! Youth was with him, love. Would he go on to greater days of beauty, or would he stumble, idling his time, wasting his substance in riotous living? Was this riotous living? Would there be evil fruition of his deeds? Would he really love Angela after he married her? Would they be happy? Thus he stood by the bank of this still lake, studying the water, marveling at the subtleties of reflected radiance, feeling the artist's joy in perfect natural beauty, twining and intertwining in all with love, death, failure, fame. It was romantic to think that in such a lake, if he were unkind, would Angela be found. By such a dark as was now descending would all her bright dreams be submerged. It would be beautiful as romance. He could imagine a great artist like Daudet or Balzac making a great story out of it. It was even a subject for some form of romantic expression in art. Poor Angela! If he were a great portrait painter, he would paint her. He thought of some treatment of her in the nude, with that mass of hair of hers falling about her neck and breasts. It would be beautiful. Should he marry her? Yes. Though he was not sure of the outcome, he must. It might be a mistake, but he stared at the fading surface of the lake. Silver, lavender, leaden gray. Overhead a vivid star was already shining. How would it be with her if she were really below those still waters? How would it be with him? It would be too desperate, too regretful. No, he must marry her. It was in this mood that he returned to the city, the ache of life in his heart. It was in this mood that he secured his grip from the hotel and sought the midnight train for New York. For once Ruby, Mary, and Christina were forgotten. He was involved in a love drama which meant life or death to Angela, peace or reproach of conscience to himself in the future. He could not guess what the outcome would be, but he felt that he must marry her. How soon he could not say. Circumstances would dictate that. From present appearances it must be immediately. He must see about a studio, announce the news of his departure to Smite and McHugh, make a special effort to further his art ambitions so that he and Angela would have enough to live on. He talked so glowingly of his art life that now, when the necessity for demonstrating it was at hand, he was troubled as to what the showing might be. The studio had to be attractive. He would need to introduce his friends. All the way back to New York he turned this over in his mind. Smite, McHugh, Miriam, Norma, Wheeler, Christina. What would Christina think if she ever returned to New York and found him married? There was no question but that there was a difference between Angela and these. It was something, a matter of courage, more soul, more daring, more awareness perhaps, something. When they saw her would they think he had made a mistake? Would they put him down as a fool? McHugh was going with a girl, but she was a different type, intellectual, smart. He thought and thought, but he came back to the same conclusion always. He would have to marry her. There was no way out. He would have to. End of section 27. Section 28 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 28. The studio of Messrs. Smite, McHugh, and Witla in Waverly Place was concerned the following October with a rather picturesque event. Even in the city, the time when the leaves began to yellow, and fall brings a sense of melancholy, augmented by those preliminaries of winter, gray, lowery days, with scraps of paper, straw, bits of wood, blown about by gusty currents of air through the streets, making it almost disagreeable to be abroad. The fear of cold and storm and suffering among those who have little was already apparent. Apparent, too, was the air of renewed vitality common to those who have spent an idle summer and are anxious to work again. Shopping and marketing and barter and sales were at high key. The art world, the social world, the manufacturing world, the professional worlds of law, medicine, finance, literature were bubbling with a feeling of the necessity to do and achieve. The whole city, stung by the apprehension of winter, had an atmosphere of emprise and energy. In this atmosphere with a fairly clear comprehension of the elements which were at work making the color of the life about him, was Eugene, digging away at the task he had set himself. Since leaving Angela, he had come to the conclusion that he must complete the jointings for the exhibition which had been running in his mind during the last 2 years. There was no other way for him to make a notable impression. He saw that. Since he had returned, he had gone through various experiences. The experience of having Angela tell him that she was sure there was something wrong with her, an impression sincere enough, but based on an excited and overwrought imagination of evil to follow, and having no foundation in fact. Eugene was as yet, despite his several experiences, not sufficiently informed in such affairs to know. His lack of courage would have delayed him from asking if he had known. In the next place, facing this crisis, he had declared that he would marry her, and because of her distressed condition he thought he might as well do it now. He had wanted time to do some of the pictures he was working on, to take in a little money for drawing, to find a suitable place to live in. He had looked at various studios in various sections of the city and had found nothing, as yet, which answered to his taste or his purse. Anything with a proper light, a bath, a suitable sleeping room, and an inconspicuous chamber which might be turned into a kitchen was difficult to find. Prices were high, ranging from $50 to $125 and $150 a month. There were some new studios being erected for the rich loungers and idlers, which commanded, so he understood, $3,000 or $4,000 a year. He wondered if he should ever attain to such magnificence through his art. Again, in taking a studio for Angela and himself, there was the matter of furniture. The studio he had with Smite and McHugh was more or less of a camp. The workroom was bare of carpets or rugs. The 2 folding beds and the cot which graced their individual chambers were heirlooms from ancient predecessors, substantial but shabby. Beyond various drawings, 3 easels, and a chest of drawers for each, there was no suitable household equipment. A woman came twice a week to clean and send out the linen and make up the beds. To live with Angela required, in his judgment, many and much more significant things. His idea of a studio was some such one as that now occupied by Miriam Finch or Norma Whitmore. There ought to be furniture of a period, old Flemish or colonial, Hepplewhite or Chippendale or Sheraton, such as he saw occasionally knocking about in curio shops and second-hand stores. It could be picked up if he had time. He was satisfied that Angela knew nothing of these things. There ought to be rugs, hangings of tapestry, bits of brass, pewter, copper, old silver if he could afford it. He had an idea of some day obtaining a figure of the Christ in brass or plaster, hung upon a rough cross of walnut or teak, which could hang or stand in some corner as one might a shrine, and place before it 2 great candlesticks with immense candles smoked and dripping with wax. These lighted in a dark studio, with the outlines of Christ flickering in the shadows behind, would give the desired atmosphere to his studio. Such an equipment as he dreamed of would have cost in the neighborhood of $2,000. Of course this was not to be thought of at this period. He had no more than that in ready cash. He was writing to Angela about his difficulties in finding a suitable place when he heard of a studio in Washington Square South, which its literary possessor was going to quit for the winter. It was, so he understood, handsomely furnished, and was to be let for the rent of the studio. The owner wanted someone who would take care of it by occupying it for him until he should return the following fall. Eugene hurried round to look at it, and taken with the location, the appearance of the square from the windows, the beauty of the furnishings, felt that he would like to live here. This would be the way to introduce Angela to New York. This would be the first and proper impression to give her. Here, as in every well-arranged studio he had yet seen, were books, pictures, bits of statuary, implements of copper, and some few of silver. There was a great fish net dyed green and spangled with small bits of mirror to look like scales, which hung as a veil between the studio proper and an alcove. There was a piano done in black walnut, and odd pieces of furniture, Mission, Flemish, Venetian of the 16th century, and English of the 17th, which, despite that diversity, offered a unity of appearance and a harmony of usefulness. There was one bedroom, a bath, and a small partitioned section which could be used as a kitchen. With a few of his pictures judiciously substituted, he could see a perfect abode here for himself and his wife. The rent was $50. He decided that he would risk it. Having gone so far as to indicate that he would take it, he was made to feel partially resigned to marriage by the very appearance of this place. He decided he would marry in October. Angela could come to New York or Buffalo. She had never seen Niagara Falls, and they could be married there. She had spoken recently of visiting her brother at West Point. Then they could come here and settle down. He decided that this must be so, wrote to her to that effect, and vaguely hinted to Smite and MacHugh that he might get married shortly. This was a great blow to his partners in art, for Eugene was very popular with them. He had the habit, with those he liked, of jesting constantly. "Look at the look of noble determination on Smite's brow this morning," he would comment cheerfully on getting up. Or, "MacHugh, you lazy lout, crawl out and earn your living." MacHugh's nose, eyes, and ears would be comfortably buried in the folds of a blanket. "These hack artists," Eugene would sigh disconsolately. "There's not much to be made out of them. A pile of straw and a couple of boiled potatoes a day is all they need." "Aw, cut it out," MacHugh would grunt. To hell, I yell," would come from somewhere in the voice of Smite. "If it weren't for me," Eugene would go on, "God knows what would become of this place. A lot of farmers and fishermen trying to be artists." "And laundry wagon drivers, don't forget that," MacHugh would add, sitting up and rubbing his tousled head, for Eugene had related some of his experiences. "Don't forget the contribution made by the American Steam Laundry Company to the world of true art." "Collars and cuffs, I would have you know, is artistic," Eugene at once declared with mock dignity, "whereas plows and fish is trash." Sometimes this kidding would continue for a quarter of an hour at a stretch, when some one remark, really brighter than any other, would dissolve the whole in laughter. Work began after breakfast, to which they usually sallied forth together, and would continue unbroken save for necessary engagements or periods of entertainment, lunch and so on, until 5 in the afternoon. They had worked together now for a couple of years. They had, by experience, learned of each other's reliability, courtesy, kindness, and liberality. Criticism was free, generous, and sincerely intended to be helpful. Pleasure trips, such as walks on gray, lowery days, or in rain or brilliant sunshine, or trips to Coney Island, Far Rockaway, the theaters, the art exhibitions, the odd and peculiar restaurants of different nationalities, were always undertaken in a spirit of joyous camaraderie. Jesting as to morality, their respective abilities, their tendencies and characteristics, were all taken and given in good part. At one time it would be Joseph Smite who would come in for a united drubbing and excoriation on the part of Eugene and MacHugh. At another time Eugene or MacHugh would be the victim, the other two joining forces vigorously. Art, literature, personalities, phases of life, philosophy, were discussed by turn. As with Jerry Matthews, Eugene had learned of new things from these men, the life of fisher folk and the characteristics of the ocean from Joseph Smite, the nature and spirit of the great West from MacHugh. Each appeared to have an inexhaustible fund of experiences and reminiscence which refreshed and entertained the trio day by day, year in and year out. They were at their best, strolling, through some exhibit or preliminary view of an art collection offered for sale, when all their inmost convictions of what was valuable and enduring in art would come to the surface. All three were intolerant of reputations as such, but were strong for individual merit, whether it carried a great name or not. They were constantly becoming acquainted with the work of some genius little known here, and celebrating his talents, each to the others. Thus, Monet, Degas, Manet, Ribera, Monticelli, by turns came up for examination and praise. When Eugene then, toward the end of September, announced that he might be leaving them shortly, there was a united wail of opposition. Joseph Smite was working on a sea scene at the time, doing his best to get the proper color harmony between the worm-eaten deck of a Gold Coast trading ship, a half-naked West Coast negro handling a broken wheel, and a mass of blue-black undulations in the distance which represented the boundless sea. "Go on," said Smite incredulously, for he assumed that Eugene was jesting. There had been a steady stream of letters issuing from somewhere in the West and delivered here week after week, as there had been for MacHugh, but this by now was a commonplace and apparently meant nothing. "You marry? What the hell do you want to get married for? A fine specimen you'll make. I'll come around and tell your wife." "Sure," returned Eugene. "It's true. I may get married." He was amused at Smite's natural assumption that it was a jest. "Stow that," called MacHugh from his easel. He was working on a country corner picture, a group of farmers before a country post office. "You don't want to break up this shack, do you?" Both of these men were fond of Eugene. They found him inspiring, helpful, always intensely vigorous and apparently optimistic. "I don't want to break up any shack, but haven't I a right to get married?" "I vote no, by God," said Smite emphatically. "You'll never go out of here with my consent. Peter, are we going to stand for anything like that?" "We are not," replied MacHugh. "We'll call out the reserves if he tries any game like that on us. I'll prefer charges against him. Who's the lady, Eugene?" "I bet I know," suggested Smite. "He's been running up the 26th Street pretty regularly." Joseph was thinking of Miriam Finch, to whom Eugene had introduced both him and MacHugh. "Nothing like that, surely?" inquired MacHugh, looking over at Eugene to see if it possibly could be so. "It's all true, fellows," replied Eugene, "as God is my judge. I'm going to leave you soon." "You're not really talking seriously, are you, Witla?" inquired Joseph soberly. "I am, Joe," said Eugene quietly. He was studying the perspective of his 16th New York view. 3 engines coming abreast into a great yard of cars. The smoke, the haze, the dingy reds and blues and yellows and greens of kicked about box cars were showing with beauty, the vigor and beauty of raw reality. "Soon?" asked MacHugh, equally quietly. He was feeling that touch of pensiveness which comes with a sense of vanishing pleasures. "I think sometime in October, very likely," replied Eugene. "Jesus Christ, I'm sorry to hear that," put in Smite. He laid down his brush and strolled over to the window. MacHugh, less expressive in extremes, worked on meditatively. "When did you reach that conclusion, Witla?" he asked after a time. "Oh, I've been thinking it over for a long time, Peter," he returned. "I really should have married before if I could have afforded it. I know how things are here, or I wouldn't have sprung this so suddenly. I'll hold up my end of the rent here until you get someone else." "To hell with the rent," said Smite. "We don't want anyone else, do we, Peter? We didn't have anyone else before." Smite was rubbing his square chin and contemplating his partner as if they were facing a catastrophe. "There's no use talking about that," said Peter. "You know we don't care about the rent. Do you mind telling us who you're going to marry? Do we know her?" "You don't," returned Eugene. "She's out in Wisconsin. It's the one who writes the letters. Angela Blue is her name." "Well, here's to Angela Blue, by God, I say," said Smite, recovering his spirits and picking up his paintbrush from his board to hold aloft. "Here's to Mrs. Eugene Witla and may she never reef a sail to a storm or foul an anchor, as they say up Nova Scotia way." "Right o," added MacHugh, catching the spirit of Smite's generous attitude. "Them's my sentiments. When do you expect to get married, really, Eugene?" "Oh, I haven't fixed the time exactly. About November 1st, I should say. I hope you won't say anything about this, though, either of you. I don't want to go through any explanations." "We won't, but it's tough, you old walrus. Why the hell didn't you give us time to think it over? You're a fine jellyfish, you are." He poked him reprimandingly in the ribs. "There isn't anyone any more sorry than I am," said Eugene. "I hate to leave here, I do. But we won't lose track of each other. I'll still be around here." "Where do you expect to live? Here in the city?" asked MacHugh, still a little gloomy. "Sure. Right here in Washington Square. Remember that Dexter studio Weaver was telling about? The one on the third floor at 61? That's it." "You don't say!" exclaimed Smite. "You're in right. How'd you get that?" Eugene explained. "Well, you sure are a lucky man," observed MacHugh. "Your wife ought to like that. I suppose there'll be a cozy corner for an occasional strolling artist?" "No farmers, no seafaring men, no artistic hacks, nothing," declared Eugene dramatically. "You to hell," said Smite. "When Mrs. Witla sees us—" "She'll wish she had never come to New York," put in Eugene. "She'll wish she had seen us first," said MacHugh. End of Section 28. End of Book 1. Section 29 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, The Struggle. Chapter 1. The marriage ceremony between Eugene and Angela was solemnized at Buffalo on November 2nd. As planned, Marietta was with them. They would go, the three of them, to the Falls and to West Point, where the girls would see their brother David, and then Marietta would return to tell the family about it. Naturally, under the circumstances, it was a very simple affair, for there were no congratulations to go through with and no gifts, at least immediately, to consider and acknowledge. Angela had explained to her parents and friends that it was quite impossible for Eugene to come West at this time. She knew that he objected to a public ceremony where he would have to run the gauntlet of all her relatives, and so she was quite willing to meet him in the East and be married there. Eugene had not troubled to take his family into his confidence as yet. He had indicated on his last visit home that he might get married and that Angela was the girl in question. But since Myrtle was the only one of his family who had seen her, and she was now in Ottumwa, Iowa, they could not recall anything about her. Eugene's father was a little disappointed, for he expected to hear some day that Eugene had made a brilliant match. His boy, whose pictures were in the magazines so frequently, and whose appearance was so generally distinguished, ought in New York, where opportunities abounded, to marry an heiress at least. It was all right, of course, if Eugene wanted to marry a girl from the country, but it robbed the family of a possible glory. The spirit of this marriage celebration, so far as Eugene was concerned, was hardly right. There was the consciousness always with him of his possibly making a mistake, and feeling that he was being compelled by circumstances and his own weakness to fulfill an agreement which might better remain unfulfilled. His only urge was his desire, in the gratification of which he might find compensation for saving Angela from an unhappy spinsterhood. It was a thin reed to lean on. There could be no honest satisfaction in it. Angela was sweet, devoted, painstakingly in her attitude towards life, toward him, toward everything with which she came in contact. But she was not what he had always fancied his true mate would be, the be-all and the end-all of his existence. Where was the divine fire which on this occasion should have animated him, the lofty thoughts of future companionship, that intense feeling he had first felt about her when he had called on her at her aunt's house in Chicago? Something had happened. Was it that he had cheapened his ideal by too close contact with it? Had he taken a beautiful flower and trailed it in the dust? Was passion all there was to marriage? Or was it that true marriage was something higher, a union of fine thoughts and feelings? Did Angela share his with him? Angela did have exalted feelings and moods at times. They were not sensibly intellectual, but she seemed to respond to the better things in music and to some extent literature. She knew nothing about art, but she was emotionally responsive to many fine things. Why was not this enough to make life durable and comfortable between them? Was it not really enough? After he had gone over all these points, there was still the thought that there was something wrong in this union. Despite his supposedly laudable conduct in fulfilling an obligation which, in a way, he had helped create or created, he was not happy. He went to his marriage as a man goes to fulfill an uncomfortable social obligation. It might turn out that he would have an enjoyable and happy life, and it might turn out very much otherwise. He could not face the weight and significance of the social theory that this was for life, that if he married her today he would have to live with her all the rest of his days. He knew that was the generally accepted interpretation of marriage, but it did not appeal to him. Union ought, in his estimation, be based on keen desire to live together and on nothing else. He did not feel the obligation which attaches to children, for he had never had any and did not feel the desire for any. The child was a kind of nuisance. Marriage was a trick of nature's by which you were compelled to carry out her scheme of race continuance. Love was a lure. Desire a scheme of propagation devised by the way. Nature, the race spirit, used you as you would use a work horse to pull a load. The load in this case was race progress, and man was the victim. He did not think he owed anything to nature or to his race spirit. He had not asked to come here. He had not been treated as generously as he might have been since he arrived. Why should he do what nature bid? When he met Angela he kissed her fondly, for of course the sight of her aroused a feeling of desire which had been running in his mind so keenly for some time. Since last seeing Angela he had touched no woman, principally because the right one had not presented herself, and because the memories and the anticipations in connection with Angela were so close. Now that he was with her again, the old fire came over him, and he was eager for the completion of the ceremony. He had seen to the marriage license in the morning, and from the train on which Angela and Marietta arrived, they proceeded in a carriage direct to the Methodist preacher. The ceremony, which meant so much to Angela, meant practically nothing to him. It seemed a silly formula, this piece of paper from the marriage clerk's office, and this instructed phraseology concerning love, honor, and cherish. Certainly he would love, honor, and cherish if it were possible. If not, then not. Angela, with the marriage ring on her finger, and the words, "With this ring I thee wed," echoing in her ears, felt that all her dreams had come true. Now she was really, truly Mrs. Eugene Witla. She did not need to worry about drowning herself, or being disgraced, or enduring a lonely, commiserated old age. She was the wife of an artist, a rising one, and she was going to live in New York. What a future stretched before her! Eugene loved her after all. She imagined she could see that. His slowness in marrying her was due to the difficulty of establishing himself properly. Otherwise he would have done it before. They drove to the Iroquois Hotel and registered as man and wife, securing a separate room for Marietta. The latter, pretending an urgent desire to bathe after her railroad journey, left them, promising to be ready in time for dinner. Eugene and Angela were finally alone. He now saw how, in spite of his fine theories, his previous experiences with Angela had deadened to an extent his joy in this occasion. He had her again, it was true. His desire that he had thought of so keenly was to be gratified, but there was no mystery connected with it. His real nuptials had been celebrated at Blackwood months before. This was the commonplace of any marriage relation. It was intense and gratifying, but the original, wonderful mystery of unexplored character was absent. He eagerly took her in his arms, but there was more of crude desire than awed delight in the whole proceeding. Nevertheless, Angela was sweet to him. Hers was a loving disposition, and Eugene was the be-all and end-all of her love. His figure was of heroic proportions to her. His talent was divine fire. No one could know as much as Eugene, of course. No one could be as artistic. True, he was not as practical as some men, her brothers and brothers-in-law, for instance, but he was a man of genius. Why should he be practical? She was beginning to think already how thoroughly she would help him shape his life toward success. What a good wife she would be to him. Her training as a teacher, her experience as a buyer, her practical judgment would help him so much. They spent the 2 hours before dinner in renewed transports, and then dressed and made their public appearance. Angela had designed a number of dresses for this occasion, representing the savings of years, and tonight at dinner she looked exceptionally pretty in a dress of black silk with neck-piece and half sleeves of mother-of-pearl silk, set off with a decoration of seed pearls and black beads in set designs. Marietta, in a pale pink silk of peach-blow softness of hue, with short sleeves and a low-cut bodice, was, with all her youth and natural plumpness and gaiety of soul, ravishing. Now that she had Angela safely married, she was under no obligations to keep out of Eugene's way, nor to modify her charms in order that her sisters might shine. She was particularly ebullient in her mood, and Eugene could not help contrasting, even in this hour, the qualities of the two sisters. Marietta's smile, her humor, her unconscious courage contrasted so markedly with Angela's quietness. The luxuries of the modern hotel have become the commonplaces of ordinary existence, but to the girls they were still strange enough to be impressive. To Angela they were a foretaste of what was to be an enduring higher life. These carpets, hangings, elevators, waiters seemed in their shabby materialism to speak of superior things. One day in Buffalo, with a view of the magnificent falls at Niagara, and then came West Point, with a dress parade accidentally provided for a visiting general, and a ball for the cadets. Marietta, because of her charm and her brother's popularity, found herself so much in demand at West Point that she extended her stay to a week, leaving Eugene and Angela free to come to New York together and have a little time to themselves. They only stayed long enough to see Marietta safely housed, and then came to the city and the apartment in Washington Square. It was dark when they arrived, and Angela was impressed with the glittering galaxy of lights the city presented across the North River from 42nd Street. She had no idea of the nature of the city, but as the cab at Eugene's request turned into Broadway at 42nd Street and clattered with interrupted progress south to Fifth Avenue, she had her first glimpse of that tawdry world which subsequently became known as the Great White Way. Already its make-believe and inherent cheapness had come to seem to Eugene largely characteristic of the city and of life, but it still retained enough of the lure of the flesh and of clothes and of rushlight reputations to hold his attention. Here were dramatic critics and noted actors and actresses and chorus girls, the gods and toys of avid, inexperienced, unsatisfied wealth. He showed Angela the different theaters, called her attention to distinguished names, made much of restaurants and hotels and shops and stores that sell trifles and trash, and finally turned into lower Fifth Avenue, where the dignity of great houses and great conservative wealth still lingered. At 14th Street Angela could already see Washington Arch glowing cream white in the glare of electric lights. "What is that?" she asked interestedly. "It's Washington Arch," he replied. "We live in sight of that on the south side of the square." "Oh, but it's beautiful!" she exclaimed. It seemed very wonderful to her, and as they passed under it, and the whole square spread out before her, It seemed a perfect world in which to live. "Is this where it is?" she asked, as they stopped in front of the studio building. "Yes, this is it. How do you like it?" "I think it's beautiful," she said. They went up the white stone steps of the old Bride house, in which was Eugene's leased studio, up 2 flights of red carpeted stairs, and finally into the dark studio, where he struck a match and lit, for the art of it, candles. A soft waxen glow irradiated the place as he proceeded, and then Angela saw old Chippendale chairs, a Hepplewhite writing table, a Flemish strong box containing used and unused drawings, the green stained fish net studded with bits of looking glass in imitation of scales, a square gold framed mirror over the mantel, and one of Eugene's drawings, the 3 engines in the gray, lowering weather, standing large and impressive upon an easel. It seemed to Angela the perfection of beauty. She saw the difference now between the tawdry gorgeousness of a commonplace hotel and this selection and arrangement of individual taste. The glowing candelabrum of 7 candles on either side of the square mirror surprised her deeply. The black walnut piano in the alcove behind the half-draped net drew forth an exclamation of delight. "Oh, how lovely it all is!" she exclaimed, and ran to Eugene to be kissed. He fondled her for a few minutes, and then she left again to examine in detail pictures, pieces of furniture, ornaments of brass and copper. "When did you get all this?" she asked, for Eugene had not told her of his luck in finding the departing Dexter and leasing it for the rent of the studio and its care. He was lighting the fire in the grate which had been prepared by the house attendant. "Oh, it isn't mine," he replied easily. "I leased this from Russell Dexter. He's going to be in Europe until next winter. I thought that it would be easier than waiting around to fix up a place after you came. We can get our things together next fall." He was thinking he would be able to have his exhibition in the spring, and perhaps that would bring some notable sales. Anyhow, it might bring a few, increase his repute, and give him a greater earning power. Angela's heart sank just a little, but she recovered in a moment, for after all, it was very exceptional even to be able to lease a place of this character. She went to the window and looked out. There was the great square with its 4 walls of houses, the spread of trees, still decorated with a few dusty leaves, and the dozens of arc lights sputtering their white radiance in between, the graceful arch, cream white over the entrance of Fifth Avenue. "It's so beautiful!" she exclaimed again, coming back to Eugene and putting her arms about him. "I didn't think it would be anything as fine as this. You're so good to me." She put up her lips and he kissed her, pinching her cheeks. Together they walked to the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. Then after a time they blew out the candles and retired for the night. End of section 29. Section 30 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 2. After the quiet of a small town, the monotony and simplicity of country life, the dreary, reiterated weariness of teaching a country school, this new world into which Angela was plunged seemed to her astonished eyes to be compounded of little save beauties, curiosities, and delights. The human senses, which weary so quickly of reiterated sensory impressions, exaggerate with equal readiness the beauty and charm of the unaccustomed. If it is new, therefore, it must be better than that which we have had of old. The material details with which we are able to surround ourselves seem at times to remake our point of view. If we have been poor, wealth will seem temporarily to make us happy. When we have been amid elements and personages discordant to our thoughts, to be put among harmonious conditions seems, for the time being, to solve all our woes. So little do we have that interior peace which no material conditions can truly affect or disturb. When Angela awoke the next morning, the studio in which she was now to live seemed the most perfect habitation which could be devised by man. The artistry of the arrangement of the rooms, the charm of the conveniences, a bathroom with hot and cold water next to the bedroom, a kitchen with an array of necessary utensils. In the rear portion of the studio, used as a dining room, a glimpse of the main studio gave her the sense of art which dealt with nature, the beauty of the human form, colors, tones, how different from teaching school. To her the difference between the long, low, rambling house at Blackwood, with its vine ornamented windows, its somewhat haphazard arrangements of flowers, and its great lawn, and this peculiarly compact and ornate studio apartment looking out upon Washington Square, was all in favor of the latter. In Angela's judgment there was no comparison. She could not have understood, if she could have seen into Eugene's mind at this time, how her home town, her father's single farm, the blue waters of the little lake near her door, the shadows of the tall trees on her lawn, were somehow compounded for him not only with classic beauty itself, but with her own charm. When she was among these things, she partook of their beauty and was made more beautiful thereby. She did not know how much she had lost in leaving them behind. To her, all these older elements of her life were shabby and unimportant, pointless and to be neglected. This new world was in its way for her an Aladdin's cave of delight. When she looked out on the great square for the first time the next morning, seeing it bathed in sunlight, a dignified line of red brick dwellings to the north, a towering office building to the east, trucks, carts, cars, and vehicles clattering over the pavement below, it all seemed gay with youth and energy. "We'll have to dress and go out to breakfast," said Eugene. "I didn't think to lay anything in. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't have known what to buy if I had wanted to. I have never tried housekeeping for myself." "Oh, that's all right," said Angela, fondling his hands. "Only let's not go out to breakfast unless we have to. Let's see what's here." And she went back to the very small room devoted to cooking purposes, to see what cooking utensils had been provided. She had been dreaming of housekeeping and cooking for Eugene, of petting and spoiling him, and now the opportunity had arrived. She found that Mr. Dexter, their generous lessor, had provided himself with many conveniences. Breakfast and dinner sets of brown and blue porcelain, a coffee percolator, a charming dull blue teapot with cups to match, a chafing dish, a set of waffle irons, griddles, spiders, skillets, stew and roasting pans, and knives and forks of steel and silver in abundance. Obviously, he had entertained from time to time, for there were bread, cake, sugar, flour, and salt boxes, and a little chest containing, in small drawers, various spices. "Oh, it will be easy to get something here," said Angela, lighting the burners of the gas stove to see whether it was in good working order. "We can just go out to market, if you'll come and show me once, and get what we want. It won't take a minute. I'll know after that." Eugene consented gladly. She had always fancied she would be an ideal housekeeper, and now that she had her Eugene, she was anxious to begin. It would be such a pleasure to show him what a manager she was, how everything would go smoothly in her hands, how careful she would be of his earnings, their joint possessions. She was sorry, now that she saw that art was no great producer of wealth, that she had no money to bring him. But she knew that Eugene, in the depths of his heart, thought nothing of that. He was too impractical. He was a great artist, but when it came to practical affairs she felt instinctively that she was much the wiser. She had bought so long, calculated so well for her sisters and brothers. Out of her bag, for her trunks had not yet arrived, she extracted a neat house dress of pale green linen, which she put on after she had done up her hair in a cozy coil, and together with Eugene for a temporary guide, they set forth to find the stores. He had told her, looking out the windows, that there were lines of Italian grocers, butchers, and vegetable men in the side streets leading south from the square, and into one of these they now ventured. The swarming, impressive life of the street almost took her breath away, it was so crowded. Potatoes, tomatoes, eggs, flour, butter, lamb chops, salt, a dozen little accessories were all purchased in small quantities, and then they eagerly returned to the studio. Angela was a little disgusted with the appearance of some of the stores, but some of them were clean enough. It seemed so strange to her to be buying in an Italian street, with Italian women and children about, their swarthy, leathern faces set with bright, almost feverish eyes. Eugene in his brown corduroy suit and soft green hat, watching and commenting at her side, presented such a contrast. He was so tall, so exceptional, so laconic. "I like them when they wear rings in their ears," he said at one time. "Get the coal man who looks like a bandit," he observed at another. "This old woman here might do for the Witch of Endor." Angela attended strictly to her marketing. She was gay and smiling but practical. She was busy wondering in what quantities she should buy things, how she would keep fresh vegetables, whether the ice box was really clean, how much delicate dusting the various objects in the studio would require. The raw brick walls of the street, the dirt and slops in the gutter, the stray cats and dogs, hungry and lean, the swarming stream of people, did not appeal to her as picturesque at all. Only when she heard Eugene expatiating gravely did she begin to realize that all this must have artistic significance. If Eugene said so, it did. But it was a fascinating world, whatever it was, and it was obvious that she was going to be very, very happy. There was a breakfast in the studio then of hot biscuit with fresh butter, an omelet with tomatoes, potatoes stewed in cream, and coffee. After the long period of commonplace restaurant dining which Eugene had endured, this seemed ideal. To sit in your own private apartment with a charming wife opposite you, ready to render you any service, and with an array of food before you which revived the finest memories in your gustatory experience, seemed perfect. Nothing could be better. He saw visions of a happy future if he could finance this sort of thing. It would require a lot of money, more than he had been making, but he thought he could make out. After breakfast Angela played on the piano, and then, Eugene wanting to work, she started housekeeping in earnest. The trunks arriving gave her a task of unpacking, and with that and lunch and dinner, to say nothing of love, she had had sufficient to do. It was a charming existence for a little while. Eugene suggested that they should have Smite and MacHugh to dinner first of all, these being his closest friends. Angela agreed heartily, for she was only too anxious to meet the people he knew. She wanted to show him she knew how to receive and entertain as well as anyone. She made great preparations for the Wednesday evening following, the night fixed for the dinner, and when it came was on the qui vive to see what his friends were like and what they would think of her. The occasion passed off smoothly enough, and was the occasion of considerable jollity. These two cheerful worthies were greatly impressed with the studio. They were quick to praise it before Angela, and to congratulate him on his good fortune in having married her. Angela, in the same dress in which she had appeared at dinner in Buffalo, was impressive. Her mass of yellow hair fascinated the gaze of both Smite and MacHugh. "Gee, what hair!" Smite observed secretly to MacHugh, when neither Angela nor Eugene were within hearing distance. "You're right," returned MacHugh. "She's not at all bad looking, is she?" "I should say not," returned Smite, who admired Angela's simple, good-natured Western manners. A little later, more subtly, they expressed their admiration to her, and she was greatly pleased. Marietta, who had arrived late that afternoon, had not made her appearance yet. She was in the one available studio bedroom making her toilet. Angela, in spite of her fine raiment, was busy superintending the cooking, for although through the janitor she had managed to negotiate the loan of a girl to serve, she could not get anyone to cook. A soup, a fish, a chicken, and a salad were the order of procedure. Marietta finally appeared, ravishing in pink silk. Both Smite and MacHugh sat up, and Marietta proceeded to bewitch them. Marietta knew no order or distinctions in men. They were all slaves to her, victims to be stuck on the spit of her beauty and broiled in their amorous uncertainties at her leisure. In after years Eugene learned to speak of Marietta's smile as the dagger. The moment she appeared smiling he would say, "Ah, we have it out again, have we? Who gets the blade this evening, poor victim?" Being her brother-in-law now, he was free to slip his arm about her waist, and she took this family connection as license to kiss him. There was something about Eugene which held her always. During this first few days she gratified her desire to be in his arms, but always with a sense of reserve which kept him in check. She wondered secretly how much he liked her. Smite and MacHugh, when she appeared, both rose to do her service. MacHugh offered her his chair by the fire. Smite bestirred himself in an aimless fashion. "I've had such a dandy week up at West Point," began Marietta cheerfully, "dancing, seeing dress parades, walking with the soldier boys." "I warn you two here and now," began Eugene, who had already learned to tease Marietta, "that you're not safe. This woman here is dangerous. As artists in good standing, you had better look out for yourselves." "Oh, Eugene, how you talk!" laughed Marietta, her teeth showing effectively. "Mr. Smite, I leave it to you. Isn't that a mean way to introduce a sister-in-law? I'm here for just a few days, too, and have so little time. I think it's cruel." "It's a shame," said Smite, who was plainly a willing victim. "You ought to have another kind of brother-in-law. If you had some people I know now." "It's an outrage," commented MacHugh. "There's one thing, though. You may not require so very much time." "Now I think that's ungallant," Marietta laughed. "I see I'm all alone here except for Mr. Smite. Never mind. You all will be sorry when I'm gone." "I believe that," replied MacHugh feelingly. Smite simply stared. He was lost in admiration of her cream and peach complexion, her fluffy, silky brown hair, her bright blue eyes and plump, rounded arms. Such radiant good nature would be heavenly to live with. He wondered what sort of a family this was that Eugene had become connected with. Angela, Marietta, a brother at West Point. They must be nice, conservative, well-to-do Western people. Marietta went to help her sister, and Smite, in the absence of Eugene, said, "Say, he's in right, isn't he? She's a peach. She's got it a little on her sister." MacHugh merely stared at the room. He was taken with the complexion and arrangement of things generally. The old furniture, the rugs, the hangings, and the pictures. Eugene's borrowed maidservant in a white apron and cap. Angela, Marietta, the bright table set with colored china and an arrangement of silver candlesticks. Eugene had certainly changed the tenor of his life radically within the last 10 days. Why, he was marvelously fortunate. This studio was a wonderful piece of luck. Some people, and he shook his head meditatively. "Well," said Eugene, coming back after some final touches to his appearance, "what do you think of it, Peter?" "You're certainly moving along, Eugene. I never expected to see it. You ought to praise God. You're plain lucky." Eugene smiled enigmatically. He was wondering whether he was. Neither Smite nor MacHugh nor anyone could dream of the condition under which this came about. What a sham the world was anyhow. Its surface appearances so ridiculously deceptive. If anyone had known of the apparent necessity, when he first started to look for an apartment, of his own mood toward it. Marietta came back, and Angela. The latter had taken kindly to both these men, or boys, as she already considered them. Eugene had a talent for reducing everybody to simple folks, as he called them, so these two capable and talented men were mere country boys like himself, and Angela caught his attitude. "I'd like to have you let me make a sketch of you some day, Mrs. Witla," MacHugh said to Angela when she came back to the fire. He was essaying portraiture as a sideline, and he was anxious for good opportunities to practice. Angela thrilled at the invitation and the use of her new name, Mrs. Witla, by Eugene's old friends. "I'd be delighted," she replied, flushing. "My word, you look nice, Angel Face!" exclaimed Marietta, catching her about the waist. "You paint her with her hair down in braids, Mr. MacHugh. She makes a stunning Gretchen." Angela flushed anew. "I've been reserving that for myself, Peter," said Eugene, "but you try your hand at it. I'm not much in portraiture, anyhow." Smite smiled at Marietta. He wished he could paint her, but he was poor at figure work, except as incidental characters in sea scenes. He could do men better than he could women. "If you were an old sea captain now, Miss Blue," he said to Marietta gallantly, "I could make a striking thing out of you." "I'll try to be, if you want to paint me," she replied gaily. "I'd look fine in a big pair of boots and a raincoat, wouldn't I, Eugene?" "You certainly would if I'm any judge," replied Smite. "Come over to the studio and I'll rig you out. I have all those things on hand." "I will," she replied, laughing. "You just say the word." MacHugh felt as if Smite were stealing a march on him. He wanted to be nice to Marietta, to have her take an interest in him. "Now, looky, Joseph," he protested. "I was going to suggest making a study of Miss Blue myself." "Well, you're too late," replied Smite. "You didn't speak quick enough." Marietta was greatly impressed with this atmosphere in which Angela and Eugene were living. She expected to see something artistic, but nothing so nice as this particular studio. Angela explained to her that Eugene did not own it, but that made small difference in Marietta's estimate of its significance. Eugene had it. His art and social connections brought it about. They were beginning excellently well. If she could have as nice a home when she started on her married career, she would be satisfied. They sat down about the round teak table, which was one of Dexter's prized possessions, and were served by Angela's borrowed maid. The conversation was light and for the most part pointless, serving only to familiarize these people with each other. Both Angela and Marietta were taken with the two artists because they felt in them a note of homely conservatism. These men spoke easily and naturally of the trials and triumphs of art life and the difficulty of making a good living, and seemed to be at home with personages of repute in one world and another, its greatest reward. During the dinner Smite narrated experiences in his seafaring life, and MacHugh of his mountain camping experiences in the West. Marietta described experiences with her beau in Wisconsin, and characteristics of her yokel neighbors at Blackwood, Angela joining in. Finally MacHugh drew a pencil sketch of Marietta, followed by a long train of admiring yokels, her eyes turned up in a very shy, deceptive manner. "Now I think that's cruel," she declared, when Eugene laughed heartily. "I never look like that." "That's just the way you look and do," he declared. "You're the broad and flowery path that leadeth to destruction." "Never mind, Babyette," put in Angela. "I'll take your part if no one else will. You're a nice, demure, shrinking girl, and you wouldn't look at anyone, would you?" Angela got up and was holding Marietta's head mock sympathetically in her arms. "Say, that's a dandy pet name," called Smite, moved by Marietta's beauty. "Poor Marietta," observed Eugene. "Come over here to me and I'll sympathize with you." "You don't take my drawing in the right spirit, Miss Blue," put in MacHugh cheerfully. "It's simply to show how popular you are." Angela stood beside Eugene as her guests departed, her slender arm about his waist. Marietta was coquetting finely with MacHugh. These two friends of his, thought Eugene, had the privilege of singleness to be gay and alluring to her. With him that was over now. He could not be that way to any girl any more. He had to behave, be calm and circumspect. It cut him, this thought. He saw at once it was not in accord with his nature. He wanted to do just as he had always done, make love to Marietta if she would let him, but he could not. He walked to the fire when the studio door was closed. "They're such nice boys," exclaimed Marietta. "I think Mr. MacHugh is as funny as he can be. He has such droll wit." "Smite is nice too," replied Eugene defensively. "They're both lovely, just lovely," returned Marietta. "I like Mr. MacHugh a little the best. He's quainter," said Angela. "But I think Mr. Smite is just as nice as he can be. He's so old fashioned. There's not anyone as nice as my Eugene, though," she said affectionately, putting her arm about him. "Oh, dear, you two!" exclaimed Marietta. "Well, I'm going to bed." Eugene sighed. They had arranged a couch for her, which could be put behind the silver spangled fish net in the alcove when company was gone. Eugene thought what a pity that already this affection of Angela's was owed to him. It was not as it would be if he had taken Marietta or Christina. They went to their bedroom to retire, and then he saw that all he had was passion. Must he be satisfied with that? Could he be? It started a chain of thought which, while persistently interrupted or befogged, was really never broken. Momentary sympathy, desire, admiration might obscure it, but always fundamentally it was there. He had made a mistake. He had put his head in a noose. He had subjected himself to conditions which he did not sincerely approve of. How was he going to remedy this, or could it ever be remedied? End of section 30.